Hi guys. Tonight, we step through the heavy gates of a medieval castle in midwinter. The stone walls rise higher than your neck can crane, frost clinging to every ledge. The air nips at your face, so sharp it feels like tiny blades, and the snow crunches beneath your boots in rhythms that sound louder than they should. Inside, the corridors don't feel much warmer. Stone has a way of holding on to cold. You breathe out clouds of mist, almost amused at the idea that anyone could ever have called this fortress home. You probably won't survive this season without a stash of salted food, a few trusted servants, and maybe a miracle or two. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, tell me where you're listening from and what time of night it is for you. Now, dim the lights. You picture yourself trudging through the castle's courtyard, where the snow lies thick. A few bundled servants haul logs toward the kitchens. The scent of wood smoke drifts on the air, faint but inviting, a reminder that somewhere inside these walls, fire is struggling against the cold. The truth is, castles in winter weren't cozy. They were marvels of defense. But comfort? Not so much. Stone walls trap chill as much as they keep enemies out. In many towers, frost literally painted patterns across the inside walls. The only real warmth comes from crowded halls, hearth fires, and layers upon layers of wool and fur. As you duck into the great hall, you sense the tension in the air, half hunger, half hope. The great fireplaces roar, but the heat barely pushes against the cavernous emptiness of the chamber. Your breath still fogs. The lord and his household gather here not only to dine, but to prove they still control abundance, even as snowdrifts pile against the gates. One historical fact worth remembering. Medieval lords staged winter feasts as much for morale and power as for nourishment. A grand spread reassured allies, servants, and even themselves that their stores would last. But here's a quirkier detail. In some castles, rushes scattered across the floor trapped scraps of food and grease all season, layered until they practically became a second carpet, one that stank, of course, when spring thaw came. Imagine sitting by the fire, nibbling your salted beef, while beneath your boots lie months of half-rotten crumbs, feathers, and bones, a medieval version of "Don't Look Down." Yet the question nags. How plentiful were these tables really? Scholars still debate whether the vast feasts depicted in manuscript illustrations represent everyday abundance or special occasions written large for posterity. Was the winter diet as lavish as it looks in those brightly coloured pages? Or did the artists exaggerate the bounty to flatter their patrons? That uncertainty lingers like smoke in the rafters. Your gaze drifts to the trestle tables, empty now but soon to be set with trenchers of bread, thick slabs of meat, and pitchers of ale. At least, that's the dream. The reality for many inside these walls is a careful rationing of supplies. Every bite tonight must stretch into February, and then March, and possibly longer if spring is late. The steward knows this better than anyone. His arithmetic, done by candlelight, might be the most important work in the whole castle. Listen closely, and you hear the sounds of life trying to wrestle comfort from the cold. The clatter of pots in the kitchen, the muttered prayers of servants worried about dwindling stores, the high-pitched laughter of children chasing each other near the hearth. The mix of human voices and fire crackle carries you toward a strange sense of community. Even in the bleakest winter, food scarce, salted, or stale held people together. And as you step deeper into the hall, your eyes trace the banners above. The heraldry glows faint in the firelight, red lions and golden lilies almost mocking the emptiness of the pantry. This place is a theatre where survival wears the costume of plenty. Tonight, you'll walk behind the curtain and see what actually ends up in the bowls. The cold presses closer, and you find yourself wondering, when the firewood dwindles and the stores run low, what then? That answer lies in the next trenchers of bread and barrels of meat. You settle yourself near the long trestle table in the great hall, and the sheer scale of the room pulls your gaze upward. The rafters loom like ribs of some gigantic stone beast, blackened with centuries of smoke. The firelight flickers, reflecting off shields and spears hung for display, but the shadows swallow more than they reveal. Tonight the hall is set for a meal, not a battle, though in its own way the dinner is just as strategic. The table stretches almost the entire length of the chamber, covered in a rough cloth. Wooden trenchers, thick slabs of stale bread used as plates are laid out in anticipation. You lean closer and see how the surface is darkened from the grease of countless meals. The Lord will sit at the raised dais, of course, making sure that everyone notices his place at the head. Even during a season of scarcity, hierarchy is the real dish being served. One established fact stands firm. The medieval Great Hall wasn't just a dining room. It was a stage for power. Eating in public was a way for lords to remind everyone that their household could still command plenty, even in the bleakest midwinter. To sit at his table was both privilege and performance. But watch closely, and you'll notice the subtle cheats. Behind the scenes, the cooks cut portions thinner, adding extra broth to the stews, filling bellies with liquid instead of meat. Candles are set more generously at the high table, so the lord's plates gleam, while further down the hall, servants hunch in dimness, picking at scraps. A cheeky tidbit? Some castle accounts suggest that cooks deliberately oversalted the meat at the lower tables, making servants drink more ale, which in turn kept them cheerful and less hungry. Medieval catering hacks, if you will. And still, questions linger in the shadows. Some historians argue that the grandeur of these meals was only occasional, tied to festivals or visits from important guests. Others insist that the Great Hall saw nightly ritualized suppers, even if the food was plain. Was every winter evening filled with pomp, or were most nights quieter, the drama exaggerated by chroniclers eager to flatter their masters? The debate continues, like the echo of footsteps on flagstones. Your eyes follow the steward pacing at the side, making quick calculations in his head. Each barrel of salted beef must last. Each loaf of bread must be rationed. His job isn't glamorous, but it's vital. One misstep and the household could face hunger before spring. Servants carry in platters now. Roasted meats, steaming pottage, trenchers piled with dark bread. The smell of smoke and fat mingles with the tang of ale. A murmur rises as the meal begins, voices overlapping, laughter forced but welcome. The great hall becomes, for a short while, the warmest place in the castle. You shift your seat and notice the cold seeping through the soles of your shoes. Despite the fire and the food, the chill never leaves. That's the truth of castle dining. Splendor and scarcity coexisted on the same table, every bite a reminder that winter was still waiting outside. So you take another sip of weak ale, watch the flames dance higher, and realize that tonight's feast isn't just about eating, it's about convincing yourself and everyone else that survival is still possible. You lean closer to the table, and the first thing that strikes you isn't the meat or the stews, but the bread. Thick, coarse loaves, darker than what you know as bread today, rest heavily on the trenchers. When you break off a piece, it feels dense in your hand, the crust so hard it could almost double as a weapon. This isn't the fluffy, golden bakery bread of modern dreams. It's sustenance, pure and plain. Bread is the backbone of winter survival inside the castle walls. Historical accounts make clear that medieval people ate bread in staggering quantities, sometimes a pound or more per person per day. The grains were often rye, barley, or oats, mixed with wheat only if the harvest had been good or if the household was wealthy. The quality of your loaf spoke volumes about your status. Lords enjoyed manchet bread, pale and soft, while servants gnawed through maslin, a rough mixture of grains that filled the belly more than it pleased the palate. Here's the quirky twist. Those trenchers in front of you, the slabs of stale bread used as plates, weren't thrown away after the meal. They soaked up the grease, sauces, and juices, and were either eaten later by the poor of the household, given to beggars at the gate, or tossed to the dogs. Imagine finishing your dinner, and then having your plate handed off as someone else's supper. Recycling, medieval style. But the picture isn't entirely clear. Some scholars argue over just how widespread wheat bread truly was in these northern castles. Did most households rely almost entirely on dark rye through the winter, saving wheat flour only for the lord's family? Or did wealthier strongholds manage to provide fine white loaves more often than records suggest? The evidence is patchy, leaving room for debate that still simmers among historians. You bite into your piece of bread. The flavor is sour, earthy, with a faint tang from fermentation. The chewiness forces you to slow down, and the rough grains scratch the roof of your mouth. It fills you up, but it's far from indulgent. Still, with butter or dripping smeared across it, the loaf becomes a small comfort against the relentless cold. The hall echoes with the sound of teeth crunching through crusts, mugs slamming onto tables, laughter rising in bursts. Everyone here depends on these loaves, from the lord at the high table to the scullery boy in the shadows. The bread unites them all, even while dividing them by quality. And so, in the heart of winter, you realize that survival in the castle doesn't come in golden banquets or endless roasts. It comes in these dense, stubborn loaves that last as long as the steward's stores can stretch them. Bread is not just food here. It is endurance made edible. You sit back, brushing the crumbs from your fingers, and the scent in the hall shifts. It's heavier, saltier, sharper, the unmistakable presence of meat that has been packed away for months. The great barrels lining the storerooms are hauled up now, their iron hoops creaking as the lids are pried loose. A waft of brine and age greets you before the first slab even lands on the table. This is winter's insurance. Salted meat. Without it, the castle would crumble long before spring thaw. Pork and beef were the staples, each animal slaughtered in late autumn, carved into manageable cuts, and preserved in salt until the icy months demanded their sacrifice. The ritual of butchering in November wasn't just practical, it was a communal event, almost a festival. Families gathered to process every last part of the animal. Hams, shoulders, bellies, tongues, and even ears. Nothing went to waste, and once the fresh cuts had been eaten, the rest went under layers of coarse salt, buried like treasure waiting to be unearthed. The historical fact stands solid. Castles relied on these salted stores to survive. Fresh meat in January was rare unless you had hunting rights or an extraordinary stroke of luck. Instead, these brined slabs became the protein that kept households moving through the snow. Without them, you'd have little but bread and broth to chew. But salted meat isn't glamorous. You notice how stiff and leathery it feels as it's hauled from the brine. The cook must soak it in water overnight, sometimes longer, to draw out the salt before it can be boiled or roasted. Even then, the texture is tough, the flavor dominated by preservation more than freshness. Yet when hunger presses hard, the salty chew feels like luxury. Here's a quirkier detail that might wrinkle your nose. Some records suggest that meat left too long in brine developed a strange, fishy tang, almost like it had swapped species somewhere along the way. To hide this, cooks used spices, pepper, cloves, ginger if they could afford them. If not, the solution was simply longer boiling and more bread to mask the taste. Imagine chewing through beef that tastes faintly of cod, while trying to convince yourself it's hearty fare. Medieval dining demanded both strong stomachs and strong imaginations. And still, the arguments flicker among scholars. How much salted meat actually reached the servants' bowls? Did the lower ranks subsist more on pottage and bones, while the lord's family consumed the real cuts? Or was salted pork so common that even the scullions tasted it often? The records are ambiguous, shaped by who kept them and for whom they wrote. Some argue that the poorer servants saw meat rarely, while others point to household accounts, showing barrels allocated across all ranks. The truth may lie somewhere in between, blurred by hunger and hierarchy. You watch as the meat is carved and served. Thick chunks drop onto trenchers, juices pooling, the smell rich yet faintly metallic. Steam curls up in ribbons, carrying hints of garlic and onions that were boiled with the cuts to soften the salt. The lord at the high table receives the best slices: marbled pork belly, fatty and indulgent compared to the dry slabs doled out further down. Servants chew more slowly, gnawing at tougher cuts that take effort to swallow. Yet all eyes stay on the food, grateful that there is something to chew at all. The hall hums with the sound of teeth tearing into sinew, knives scraping against wooden trenchers, mugs lifted for ale to wash down the salt. The salt dries your mouth, making you thirstier with every bite. You take another gulp of weak ale, its sourness cutting through the heaviness of the meat. The pairing is perfect in its own rustic way. In the kitchens, the smoke thickens. Meat hangs from hooks above the fire, some of it smoked months earlier, the skins wrinkled and hard as bark. The cooks keep turning joints on spits, careful not to let the fat drip too fast into the flames. The smell of charred edges and sizzling grease makes even the most leathery slab feel appetizing. You imagine the rush of relief when the steward authorizes opening another barrel, the promise of meat where before there was only bread. Yet the system isn't foolproof. In years when salt was scarce or harvests poor, meat spoiled despite the best efforts. Some barrels grew rancid, the smell so overpowering they had to be carried outside and buried. A bitter reminder that survival wasn't guaranteed. In fact, winters could be leaner than anyone expected, driving people to gnaw bones for marrow or stretch pottage with whatever scraps remained. Picture yourself here, in January, when the snow piles higher than the battlements and the roads are impassable. The Lord's men sit sharpening blades, bored of idleness. Children gather near the fire, their hands red and raw from the cold. The salted meat is the center of the day's meal, its toughness softened by long boiling, its flavor dulled, but sustaining. It fills bellies and buys another night of survival. There's a strange comfort in this ritual. The meat is tough, the taste repetitive, but its presence signals that the household still has resources. As long as barrels remain in the storerooms, hope remains. Every slab hacked from the salted stores is one step closer to spring. The servants carry away the empty platters now, their faces slick with grease, their fingers sticky with salt. You hear the scrape of knives across the last bones, the dogs growling under the table as they fight for scraps. The meal ends not with dessert, but with relief. Relief that another day has been endured, another layer of winter survived. You lean back and let the heaviness of the salted meat settle into you. It's not a feast for the senses, but it is a feast for survival. And in this frozen castle, survival is all that truly matters. You notice the atmosphere shift again as the servants bring in the next course. Tonight isn't only about meat and bread, it's a reminder that the calendar itself shapes what you're allowed to eat. The church hovers over the table just as firmly as the Lord on the dais. And tonight that means fish. Fish has always been the loyal understudy of medieval dining, stepping onto the stage whenever meat is forbidden. Fridays, Lent, holy days, suddenly you're chewing on scales instead of skin, fins instead of fat. In a season where salted beef already feels repetitive, the obligation to swap it for salted fish might feel more punishment than piety. One well-recorded fact stands out. The medieval church required abstinence from meat on nearly half the days of the year. That's a staggering number, when you picture a calendar peppered with saints' feasts and holy observances. A noble household had to plan carefully, stocking not just pork and beef, but barrels of herring, cod, or eels to cover all those meatless days. Without fish, you'd be breaking both diet and doctrine. But the reality of fish in winter wasn't quite the romantic image of sparkling rivers and fresh catches. You lean closer and catch the scent, pungent, sharp, with a tang that lingers. This fish has traveled. Much of it was preserved, dried, smoked, or packed in brine hauled in carts from coastal markets days or even weeks away. Herring was the commoner's staple, cheap and abundant, while freshwater fish like trout or pike were reserved for those lucky enough to control fishing rights near their estates. There's an odd curiosity that might raise your eyebrows. Live eels were sometimes kept squirming in barrels of water inside castle kitchens so they could be slaughtered fresh. Imagine passing through the smoky room and seeing a half-dozen wooden tubs with slippery creatures twisting inside, ready to be stewed. Not exactly the cozy image of winter comfort you were hoping for. Yet the interpretation isn't straightforward. Some historians wonder if preserved fish truly made it into the diets of lower-ranked servants, or if it was largely reserved for the tables of monks, nuns, and high nobles. Others argue that even the humblest members of a household would have tasted herring often, given how cheaply it could be bought in bulk. The records leave us with a split impression. Did fish sustain all levels of society in winter, or did it serve mostly as another badge of status? The debate lingers like the aftertaste of salt on your tongue. As you pick up a piece, the texture is tough, almost leathery, and the salt hits hard. The cook has tried to soften it with herbs, parsley and dill, if any were dried from autumn, maybe a dash of imported pepper if the Lord is feeling generous. Still, the flavor is heavy. You take another bite, and the briny chew makes you reach instantly for ale. It's not indulgent eating, but it is necessary eating, a compromise between faith and survival. Look around the table and you see how different ranks handle the dish. At the high dais, the Lord's portion is paired with a sauce, something tart, maybe made of vinegar, mustard seed, or even almond milk if the kitchen is clever. At the servant's end, the fish arrives plain, boiled, barely enough to take the edge off hunger. The contrast is stark, but both groups chew in silence, aware that faith requires patience. The kitchens bear their own smell now, a mixture of smoke and brine. Hooks hang with smoked salmon and eel, their skins shriveled and blackened. A cauldron bubbles, filling the air with steam that makes your eyes sting. Children peer in with wrinkled noses, not entirely sure whether to be excited or repulsed. For them, meatless days feel like an endless season of chewing through bones and scales, waiting for something richer to return. Yet fish had its charms too. In wealthier castles it wasn't only herring and cod. Sometimes the steward arranged for delicacies, lampreys, strange eel, like creatures with sucker mouths that nobles adored, but which might make your stomach turn. Other times, sturgeon arrived, its flesh dense and rich, a status symbol as much as a meal. Eating such fish was a declaration. This household had connections, wealth, and control even in midwinter. What might surprise you is that some of these delicacies travelled extraordinary distances. Salted cod from the North Sea, or even from Iceland, ended up on tables in castles far inland. The medieval supply chain, powered by rivers and trade routes, made it possible for a castle in snowy Burgundy to serve fish that once swam in the Atlantic. Global logistics, centuries before you thought they existed. Still, practicality dominated most days. Fish was boiled into stews, shredded into pottages, or fried in pans when oil could be had. Recipes aimed to disguise the sameness, but by February, the repetition must have been wearying. Imagine waking up knowing that today, once again, your main protein will come from a creature that smells stronger the longer it waits in the storeroom. Faith may have demanded abstinence, but your taste buds surely muttered protests. The debate continues among researchers. Did medieval people genuinely enjoy the taste of these preserved fish, or did they tolerate it because of necessity? Was devotion sweetened by familiarity, or did people count down the days until meat returned to the pot? We can't quite know, but the wrinkled noses in some chronicles suggest more duty than delight. Back in the hall, mugs are raised to wash down the brine, laughter breaking out in bursts as the ale loosens tongues. For a moment, the fish becomes less about flavor and more about ritual. Everyone here shares the same salty mouthfuls, the same grumbles, the same anticipation of feasts to come. The act of eating together, bound by the same rules, binds the castle as surely as its stone walls. You set your trencher aside, wipe your hands on a rough cloth, and notice the hunger hasn't fully left. The fish has filled your stomach, yes, but it hasn't warmed you like roasted meat would. Outside, snow presses hard against the shutters, and the wind howls through cracks in the stone. Inside, you're left with the aftertaste of the sea, hundreds of miles from where the fish was caught. Still, you can't deny its role. Fish is more than a meal, it's faith, it's logistics, it's survival disguised as obedience. And as you lick the salt from your lips, you realize that winter in the castle wasn't just endured through strength of arms or walls of stone, but through barrels of brined creatures hauled from far-off shores. Without them, the calendar of saints might have starved an entire household. The hall grows quieter once the fish courses are cleared away. The smell of brine still lingers in the air, sharp and persistent, but now another scent begins to drift from the kitchen, something creamier, softer, and far more comforting. You catch the warm hint of milk bubbling in a cauldron, the tang of curds forming, the buttery richness that promises a small but meaningful change from the salt-heavy meals of the past days. Dairy is making its appearance. In winter, dairy was a gamble. The cows gave less milk, hens laid fewer eggs, and every animal felt the bite of cold just as keenly as their human keepers. Yet, when you finally taste a piece of cheese or spread a smear of butter across a crust of bread, it feels like a blessing, something familiar, and filling in a season that seems designed to wear you down. One reliable truth surfaces in the records. Cheese was one of the most important preserved foods in a medieval castle. Hard cheeses could last through the winter if stored properly, wrapped in cloth or wax to keep out the damp. They became dense, strong-smelling, and sharp with age, but they delivered much-needed fat and protein. A slice of aged cheese was fuel for long hours of shivering in the draughty halls. Then there's a curious little wrinkle. Not all cheese was aged. Soft cheeses, curds, fresh farmer's cheese, or even cream cheese like spreads were also eaten, though these had to be consumed quickly before spoiling. Sometimes they were mixed into porridges or flavored with herbs. Imagine stumbling upon a fresh, tangy lump of curds in January and realizing it's one of the few things on the table that doesn't taste like salt or smoke. But there's disagreement among historians about how available dairy really was during the coldest months. Some argue that castle herds were large enough to provide milk year-round, albeit in smaller amounts. Others believe that by deep winter, fresh dairy was almost absent, leaving only the aged wheels of cheese as reminders of sunnier months. The truth likely varies by region, by wealth, and by sheer luck with the weather. Did peasants working in the fields get even a bite of cheese in January, or was it hoarded for the Lord's table? The evidence leaves us with more questions than answers. You reach for a slice of cheese on your trencher. It's firm, crumbly, and smells faintly of grass and smoke. The taste is sharp, almost biting, but when paired with bread, it transforms the plain crust into something richer. Around you, servants chew their pieces with quiet satisfaction, the grease from the butter or the cream in the stew cutting through the monotony of salted meat. Butter, too, plays its part. Though harder to store long-term, when available it added richness to bread or melted into stews, turning humble vegetables into something indulgent. In northern castles, butter was more common, while in southern regions olive oil might appear instead. Still, nothing quite compares to the comforting weight of butter on your tongue in the middle of a frozen season. Milk itself was less frequently drunk fresh. It soured too quickly in the winter's uneven temperatures, but turned into buttermilk, whey, or clotted cream, it found its way into soups and sauces. Picture the cook stirring a pot of leek and milk broth, steam curling into the rafters, the smell soothing after endless weeks of brine. And here's a detail that may surprise you. In some places, whey from cheese, making was fed to pigs, recycling every drop of nourishment in a closed loop. What began as milk ended up, months later, as pork. A cycle of survival played out in barrels and pens, where nothing was wasted if it could be eaten. The kitchen during dairy preparation is its own world. You hear the steady clink of wooden spoons scraping curds, the hiss of cream boiling too close to the fire, the soft voices of dairymaids checking texture with practiced hands. Their work is quiet compared to the butcher's, but no less essential. In fact, the presence of butter or cheese at the table carries a certain comfort. the sense that the castle still controls a little softness in the middle of the harshest season. At the high table, the lord's family might receive delicate dishes, cheese flavoured with saffron, butter moulded into decorative shapes, or custards thickened with eggs saved for the occasion. For them, dairy could be an expression of wealth and refinement. For those further down the hall, it was a spread of butter across hard bread, or a ladle of milk-based pottage, thin but warming. Either way, the creamy textures and richer flavours offered a rare reprieve from the monotony of meat and fish. Yet dairy was never without risk. Spoilage lurked in every corner of the storerooms. A wheel of cheese left in dampness could turn sour, inedible, and even dangerous. Butter went rancid quickly if not salted heavily, and when supplies ran short, resentment stirred was the lord hoarding the last of the fresh butter, while the servants chewed their way through stale bread alone. The politics of dairy could be as sharp as the cheese itself. The children, however, hardly cared. They licked butter from their fingers, giggled over curds, and dreamed of milk warmed with honey before bed. To them, dairy was sweetness and comfort, the closest thing to a treat in a castle where sugar remained a far-off luxury. Watching their joy, you feel the heaviness of salted meat lift, if only for a moment. Some chronicles even hint at unusual dairy practices. In certain households, cheese was deliberately made so hard it could be grated into stews like a spice, stretching its use for weeks. In others, cream was churned into butter during festive days only, saved as a seasonal luxury. These quirks remind you that nothing in the castle was straightforward. Every food carried with it layers of ritual, necessity, and chance. As you finish your portion, the aftertaste lingers, strong but satisfying. You realize that dairy, fragile though it was, provided something more than calories. It offered variety, comfort, and the illusion of abundance, a reminder of warmer months when pastures were green and cows were heavy with milk. In the cold silence of January, a wheel of cheese was as much memory as it was meal. You lean back, wipe your hands, and glance around the hall. Servants scrape butter from bowls, nobles sample custards with small spoons, and the steward takes mental notes of how quickly the cheese wheel shrinks. Every bite is both nourishment and calculation, a step closer to spring or a misstep toward famine. The wind howls outside again, rattling the shutters, but for a few moments the taste of milk and butter dulls the edge of winter, and as you swallow the last crumb, you understand dairy was never guaranteed in a medieval winter, but when it appeared, it brought with it the soft whisper of survival dressed as comfort. You rise from the great hall and follow the smell of earth down into the lower chambers of the castle. The steps grow colder with each descent, the torchlight flickering across damp stone. Beneath the kitchens and storerooms lies one of winter's quiet miracles, the root cellar. You duck through a low archway and feel the change immediately cool, damp, heavy with the scent of soil and aging vegetables. This is where the castle's survival is hidden away, out of sight, yet always on the steward's mind. A clear fact from medieval household accounts is that root vegetables, parsnips, turnips, carrots, onions, and sometimes beets were the backbone of winter diet after bread. They lasted for months if kept cool and dark, their sugars slowly concentrating as they aged. By January, these weren't fresh and crisp, but wrinkled, tougher, sweeter in their own way. They went straight into potages and stews, softening in the pot until they melted into the broth. You stoop down to touch a parsnip, its skin pale and cracked, soil still clinging to it. It looks tired, but it still holds the promise of calories. Imagine being a servant in January, pulling out a basket of these roots, and knowing that this is what will keep the children alive through the snow. No parsnip, no turnip, no supper. There's a delightful oddity here too. Some chronicles describe how certain vegetables were deliberately buried back into mounds of earth or sand within the cellar, preserving them longer by mimicking the soil. You picture baskets filled with damp sand, turnips poking out like strange treasure, waiting weeks or months until someone's hunger forced them to the fire. A medieval refrigerator of sorts, but one that required daily vigilance. Yet uncertainty clouds our modern understanding. Did castles truly manage to store enough vegetables for every winter, or were cellars more symbolic than sufficient? Some scholars argue that records exaggerate storage, suggesting that spoilage rates were higher than people admitted. Others maintain that skilled stewards, especially in wealthy households, managed to stretch roots until spring with remarkable success. Which is closer to the truth? We're left peering through the cracks in surviving inventories, unable to see the full picture. The cellar smells strong. Damp stone, mildew, the sharp onion tang that makes your eyes water. Somewhere in the darkness, rats scurry, scratching for crumbs. Servants keep cats to patrol these spaces, but it's always a battle. Every turnip nibbled is one less meal. Every onion lost a reminder that survival depends on vigilance as much as abundance. Back upstairs, the cook sorts through a basket. The vegetables are chopped coarsely, skins left on, and tossed into a bubbling cauldron. They soften into pottage, thickening the broth and lending sweetness where meat fails. At the Lord's table, these same roots may be roasted with drippings, presented with a garnish of herbs, or paired with sauces to appear more refined. But in their essence, they are the same food, rough, earthy, dependable. What might surprise you is how important onions and garlic were in this mix. Not only did they flavor the otherwise bland stew, they were believed to hold medicinal power. A clove of garlic boiled with turnips wasn't just a seasoning, it was thought to guard against illness in the cold season. Eating vegetables, in this sense, became both nourishment and medicine, a way to battle the invisible dangers of winter. The servants ladle pottage into wooden bowls now. You watch the steam rise, smell the sweet carrot mingled with pungent leek. The texture is mushy, almost porridge-like, but it fills the belly. The children dip their bread into the broth, softening the crust, their faces brightening with each mouthful. For them, it is warmth itself. Yet down here in the cellar, the reality remains stark. Each week the piles shrink, each basket empties, each onion sprout signals food turning unfit. By February, desperation creeps in. Stews grow thinner, bowls contain more liquid than root. Hunger gnaws at the household, even as the lords try to mask it with ceremony. The steward, walking these chambers with a lantern, counts every sack and barrel. He knows that each missing turnip shortens the castle's endurance. His arithmetic is a quiet act of war against famine. You imagine him standing here in silence, listening to the drip of water down the walls, wondering if the cellars will stretch far enough to see another spring. Still, the ingenuity impresses you. Roots that seem humble, even boring, hold life in their skin. In a world without refrigerators, without supermarkets, without daily markets in deep snow, these wrinkled vegetables meant the difference between starvation and survival. You run your hand across the rough basket weave, feel the damp weight of soil still clinging, and realize, in this frozen world, every turnip is treasure, every carrot a jewel. They are not delicacies, but they are endurance made edible, a hidden strength beneath stone and snow. The wind howls above ground, rattling shutters and shaking banners, but down here the cellar remains steady. It smells of earth, it tastes of resilience, and it carries the castle quietly towards spring. You leave the root cellar behind and climb back toward the kitchens, where the scent shifts from earthy to something fresher, greener. Despite the snow piling outside, there are still vegetables that find their way onto the castle's tables in winter stubborn plants that refuse to give in to frost. You spot the piles now: cabbages, leeks, kale, and sometimes hardy herbs clinging to life in sheltered corners of the garden. They may not look elegant, but their persistence makes them precious. It's clear from countless medieval household accounts that cabbages and leeks were central to winter diets. Cabbages stored well when kept cool, their tight heads layered like natural containers, while leeks could be pulled even from frozen ground with enough determination. They appear again and again in recipes for winter stews, potages, and broths, stretching out whatever meat or grain might be available. Without them, meals would quickly grow thinner and less nourishing. As you peer closer at the leaves of a cabbage hauled into the kitchen, you notice their roughness, their toughness. This isn't the tender lettuce you're used to in modern salads. It's chewy, fibrous, with a sharp bite. Boiled long enough, it softens into submission, releasing a sulphurous smell that fills the hall. When blended with onions or garlic, it becomes hearty, almost sweet, a lifeline in broth form. Here's an oddity worth mentioning. In some places, cabbages were considered medicinal as much as edible. Physicians claimed they helped balance the humors of the body, curing ailments from headaches to indigestion. Imagine slurping your third bowl of boiled cabbage that week and consoling yourself with the thought that at least it might heal your melancholy. But the exact role of these vegetables is not fully agreed upon. Some researchers insist they were a daily staple for both nobles and servants, while others argue they were viewed as poor man's food and avoided by the upper classes, except in times of shortage. Did the Lord genuinely enjoy his leek pottage, or did he tolerate it as necessary filler? The truth may lie somewhere in between, shaped by region, climate, and personal taste. The smell in the kitchen grows strong as cabbages are chopped and thrown into cauldrons. You watch the green leaves wilt, turning limp and dark. Leeks are sliced into rings, their white stalks melting into the broth, their flavor rich and oniony. Together, they create a pottage that simmers all day, fed with scraps of bread or bones, served to servants in steaming bowls that warm cold hands. The high table, of course, receives something more refined. A leek tart thickened with eggs and cream might appear, or cabbages dressed with a sauce of butter and herbs. Presentation becomes a way of disguising the plainness of the ingredient, but at their heart, both rich and poor are chewing on the same hardy greens, bound by the stubborn resilience of plants that survive the snow. What might catch you off guard is the noise. The kitchen rings with chopping knives, the hiss of boiling cauldrons, the voices of dairymaids and cooks exchanging quick instructions. There's laughter too, because even in scarcity, cabbage soup bubbling in a pot feels like reassurance. The servants lean over the steam, inhaling deeply, their cheeks pink from the heat after hours in the freezing corridors. When the bowls are ladled out, the scene shifts to the hall once more. You dip your spoon into the thick broth, the steam warming your face. The taste is simple, earthy, slightly bitter at first, but then it grows on you. Paired with bread, it fills you, not with luxury, but with the sense that the castle can endure another day. Children sip it greedily, wiping their mouths with the backs of their hands, while elders nod, satisfied to taste something beyond salt and brine. The debate about how these vegetables were perceived lingers among scholars. Some argue that manuscripts and cookbooks underreport their use because they were too ordinary to record, the daily fare of commoners rather than the glamorous dishes of nobles. Others suggest the opposite, that their medicinal and symbolic importance made them more valued than we assume today. The truth, as always, remains murky, caught between everyday necessity and cultural bias. Still, you can't deny their value. In a world where freshness was fleeting, cabbages and leeks stood strong. They were humble, yes, but their very humility made them powerful. Without them, pottage would collapse into thin water, and winter would gnaw harder at empty stomachs. As you finish your bowl, you notice how the warmth spreads through your chest, slower than wine but steadier. The wind rattles the shutters again, snow whirls in the courtyard, but you feel anchored, sustained. These greens may not dazzle, but they endure, and in winter, endurance is the greatest feast of all. The steam rising from the cauldron thickens, and you realize that not everyone in the castle dines on roasted meat or even cabbages dressed in cream. For most of the servants, soldiers, and workers, the daily meal boils down to a single, reliable dish: pottage. Thin, watery, endlessly adaptable. It was both a curse and a comfort. The hall may echo with the crack of joints being carved at the high table, but for the majority sitting further down, their world is a bowl of stew that rarely changed. The hard truth, well attested by medieval records, is that pottage fed the bulk of the population. Grain, roots, greens, and whatever scraps of fat or bone the kitchen could spare went into the pot, bubbling together into a dish that might be thick and nourishing one day, watery and sad the next. It wasn't glamorous, but it filled the belly, and that was enough. You take a seat near the servant's end of the table, wooden bowl in hand. The liquid is hot, almost too hot, the steam making your face prickle. You sip, and the taste is bland. Onions, cabbage, a whisper of barley. If you're lucky, there's a shred of salted meat or a lump of cheese stirred in, but often it's just vegetables stretched thin across too much water. The texture is soft, almost mush, and it slides down quickly. Hunger makes you grateful, even as your tongue longs for more flavor. Here's a detail that might amuse you. Some recipes for pottage included whatever herbs grew nearby, and that sometimes meant nettles. Imagine being served a soup with leaves that could sting your fingers raw if touched fresh. Once boiled, they lost their bite. But the idea of eating nettles tells you just how resourceful medieval cooks had to be. Nothing green went to waste, not when snow covered the fields. Still, scholars puzzle over the exact role of pottage in noble households. Was it truly the main meal for all but the lord and his family? Or was it more universal, eaten even at the high table but dressed up with richer additions? Some accounts describe fine pottages made with almonds, spices, and saffron, clearly designed for elite palates. Others suggest that noble families avoided the dish altogether, seeing it as the food of servants. The evidence is contradictory, leaving us to imagine both possibilities simmering side by side. The kitchens reveal another side of the story. You watch as the pot is stirred constantly, the thick liquid sticking to the bottom if neglected. Cooks drop in bread crusts, bones, and any scraps left over from earlier meals. It's less recipe than ritual, a way of recycling the castle's food into one dish that never stops cooking. The pot might bubble from dawn to dusk, its contents changing slightly as new ingredients are added, old ones ladled out. A medieval slow cooker, endlessly replenished. The servants gather around, bowls in hand, slurping noisily. Their laughter is tired but genuine, their hunger dulled for now. Children scoop the mush with bread, softening their crusts in the broth, while the older men chew slowly, grateful for the warmth. The communal nature of the dish is striking. Everyone shares from the same pot. Everyone's portion looks more or less the same. Hunger levels the ranks, if only briefly. You take another spoonful, and the taste deepens. A hint of garlic, perhaps. Or maybe just the strong flavor of a leek boiled down until it disintegrates. It's not much, but it warms your throat and spreads comfort through your chest. You realize that pottage isn't about delight, it's about survival, made bearable. An unusual practice pops into your mind. Some households used beer or ale to thin their pottage instead of water, giving it a sour tang and an extra boost of calories. Imagine sipping your bowl and tasting faint yeast and malt beneath the vegetables. It sounds strange, but it turned dinner into something just a bit more filling, especially when food was running low. But the question remains, was pottage a symbol of poverty, or was it simply the default diet of winter? Chroniclers often ignored it, preferring to describe lavish feasts that made their patrons look generous. Yet the archaeological record pits full of charred grains and vegetable remnants suggests otherwise. Pottage was the steady hum of daily life, a background rhythm so constant it went unnoticed by the pens of the elite. It fed castles just as surely as it fed villages. Back in the hall, the difference is clear. The lord cuts into a roast, juices running, laughter echoing around him. You and the others chew slowly on your stewed cabbage and barley, pretending not to notice. But even here, there is comfort in shared experience. The taste may be plain, but the act of sitting together, bowls steaming in your hands, builds a kind of fellowship. Hunger is less sharp when endured as a group. The wind outside howls again, rattling the shutters, but the warmth of the pot steadies you. You look down at your empty bowl, scrape the last soggy chunk of bread from the bottom, and swallow. It's not a feast, but it's enough. In the end, pottage isn't remembered for flavor or beauty. It's remembered for constancy, for showing up day after day, pot after pot, through the worst of the winter. A bowl of stew, humble and steaming, carried entire households across the frozen months. And as you set down your bowl, you realize that in this castle, survival has always simmered quietly at the bottom of a pot. The scent in the hall shifts again, this time towards something exotic, unfamiliar, and almost theatrical. The familiar smoke of cabbage, the brine of fish, and the heavy salt of pork have all been dulled by routine. But now a sharper, sweeter fragrance cuts through the air. You catch it before the platters even arrive. A pinch of pepper, a curl of cinnamon, the earthy bite of saffron. Suddenly, the castle feels less like a stone fortress in the snow and more like a portal to faraway lands. One fact the records make impossible to ignore is this: imported spices were not only flavoring agents, but also symbols of power. Peppercorns from India, cloves from the Moluccas, saffron threads from Spain or beyond, they travelled thousands of miles before being poured onto these trenches. To taste them in a frozen hall was to taste wealth itself, proof that your household reached into the world's trade routes. You lean forward and inhale as the Lord's dish is placed on the dais. The meat glistens, sprinkled with saffron that dyes the broth golden. For a moment, the bleakness of winter seems far away. Colour and aroma lift the mood, creating the illusion of summer sunshine bottled in a spice jar. What might raise your eyebrows is how these precious seasonings were used, not only to impress or delight, but often to disguise. Salted meat gone slightly off? Add pepper. Fish too briny? Cinnamon might soften the blow. Almond milk thickened with saffron could turn an otherwise unappetizing pottage into something resembling luxury. Imagine chewing through half-rancid beef, while convincing yourself that the pepper burn on your tongue is flavor. Still, the question of how widespread these spices really were remains unsettled. Some scholars suggest that only the wealthiest castles could afford regular use, while others argue that pepper was common enough to appear even in middling households, though in smaller amounts. Did servants ever taste saffron, or was it locked firmly at the lord's end of the table? The accounts are contradictory, leaving us to wonder whether spices were daily enhancements or rare performances of wealth. You take a piece of bread and dab it into the sauce dripping from the lord's dish. The taste explodes sharp, hot, slightly sweet. Your tongue tingles in ways no cabbage stew ever could. It's intoxicating, distracting, even addictive. No wonder nobles prized these flavors. They broke the monotony of salted meat and boiled roots, turning every bite into something dramatic. The kitchens bustle like a theatre backstage. Mortars and pestles grind continuously, cooks arguing over proportions. The golden powder of saffron stains their fingers, while peppercorns crack beneath heavy stones. The noise is sharp, rhythmic, filling the room with the music of preparation. Servants carry trays of almond paste, sugar loaves shaved into delicate dust, and jars of preserved ginger. It's chaos with purpose, a frenzy designed to transform plain food into spectacle. A curious practice surfaces here. Some lords measured their wealth not in coins, but in the spices they could serve at feasts. Whole peppercorns were counted like jewels, and saffron threads weighed like gold. In some households, guests were deliberately shown the jars of spice before dining, as if to remind them that this castle's reach extended across seas and deserts. Food became theatre, and spices were the stage lights. But while nobles revelled, the servants at the lower tables got little of the glamour. Their pottage might receive a dusting of herbs, or, if they were lucky, a pinch of leftover pepper swept from the mortar. For them, spices were a faint echo of wealth, smelled more than tasted. The hierarchy was written not only in where you sat, but in how your food burned or failed to burn your tongue. You glance at the Lord now, raising a goblet of spiced wine. Cinnamon and cloves float in the liquid, releasing warmth that smells festive even in the dead of winter. His laughter rings out. His guests nod appreciatively, and the illusion of abundance grows. The hall is no warmer, the snow no less deep, but the taste of saffron tricks everyone into believing that comfort is still possible. The debate among historians lingers. Did spices primarily function as status symbols, rarely tasted by ordinary mouths? Or did they seep more broadly into medieval diets through trade and cheaper access to pepper? The evidence suggests both realities, depending on the household. In either case, the symbolism mattered as much as the taste. To serve saffron in January was to proclaim victory over distance, time, and hunger. You chew another bite and notice how the flavors linger long after the meat itself is gone. It isn't just nourishment, it's a sensory escape, a reminder that the world is larger than the frozen moat outside. Spices carry you, if only in your imagination, to lands where snow never falls and markets overflow with color. But soon the platters are cleared, the aromas fade, and the illusion breaks. You look around and see the same stone walls, the same draughts sneaking through cracks, the same weary faces of servants scraping bowls. The spice, like a performance, dazzles only briefly before vanishing. Survival still depends on salted meat and cabbage stew. Yet you can't shake the thought that these spices, these tiny fragments of distant worlds, gave people more than taste. They gave hope. They gave color to the greyest months, a spark to the dullest meals. In a season where sameness threatened to crush morale, a sprinkle of pepper or saffron made life feel rich again, even if only for an hour. As you sip the last of the spiced wine, the warmth spreads through your chest, softening the chill. You realize that spices were more than food. They were stories, memories, and promises of elsewhere. And in the middle of a freezing castle, that might have been their greatest gift of all. The feast lingers in your senses, but after the spice fades, another liquid companion takes the stage, one that never truly leaves the castle table. You lift a wooden cup, sniff, and sip. The taste is faintly sour, a little sweet, and far safer than anything drawn from the well. This is ale, sometimes called small beer, the everyday drink that flowed more reliably than water itself. A clear pattern emerges in medieval records. People of every rank drank ale daily. It was considered safer than water, which could be contaminated by waste from humans and animals alike. Brewing, even when crude, boiled away dangers and turned grain into liquid nourishment. Adults, children, nobles, and servants all consumed it, though the strength and quality varied wildly depending on status and circumstance. You take another sip, and notice how weak it island. The alcohol content is low, barely enough to blur your vision, but that wasn't the point. This small beer was hydration as much as indulgence, providing calories in liquid form. It filled bellies, kept thirst at bay, and made life in freezing stone halls just a little more bearable. One detail that might make you smile. Brewing wasn't only the work of professional alewives or monastery brewers. In some castles, every kitchen maid was expected to know the basics of fermenting grains into drink. Some batches turned out sweet and smooth, others sharp and vinegary, but all were consumed with little hesitation. Imagine living in a place where drinking water straight from the well was considered reckless, but giving your child a mug of beer before bed was completely ordinary. But there's still disagreement about the exact role of ale in castle diets. Did servants truly drink it at every meal, or was it rationed more carefully than we assume? Some historians argue that lower quality ale was brewed in huge quantities and ladled out daily, while others suggest it was scarcer in winter, forcing people to stretch thinner batches. The truth likely lies between these views, shaped by the size of the household and the stores of grain. The brewing process itself was a spectacle. Down in the castle's brewhouse, huge cauldrons boiled with malted barley. Steam filled the chamber, smelling sweet and earthy, a contrast to the acrid smoke of the kitchens. Wooden tubs lined the walls, frothing with fermenting liquid, a sour tang rising as yeast did its quiet work. Servants moved constantly, stirring, skimming, transferring liquid from one vessel to another. The process was laborious, but continuous. There was no pause in brewing when dozens of mouths depended on the drink. At the high table, ale could be clear and golden, flavoured with imported hops or herbs like rosemary and sage. For servants, the drink was cloudy, gritty, sometimes sour enough to make the lips pucker. But either way, it warmed the body and softened the sharp edges of daily life. You sip again and feel it spread, not as fiery heat but as a mellow comfort. Conversation in the hall grows louder, laughter rising, arguments softening. Ale loosened tongues and eased tempers, playing its role in the social rhythm of the castle. Without it, winter nights would have been far gloomier. There's an amusing tidbit from some chronicles. Records of ale rations being so large that by modern standards, each adult consumed several litres a day. Of course, much of it was low in alcohol, closer to liquid bread than modern beer. Still, the sheer volume is staggering. Picture a castle where everyone, from lord to scullion, walks around with a faint buzz, the hall echoing with cheerful slurs instead of grim silence. And yet, ale wasn't invincible. Grain shortages in bad harvest years meant brewing had to be cut back, and households sometimes stretched their supplies by thinning batches almost to water. In those winters, ale was no longer indulgence but pale imitation, reminding everyone that survival teetered on the edge. Some scholars point out another uncertainty. How common was the addition of herbs or fruit to liven the flavour? Recipes survive for gruit, ale brewed with mixtures of heather, yarrow or bog myrtle. But whether these were everyday drinks or festival luxuries remains unclear. The evidence is tantalizing but incomplete, like half-finished mugs left behind centuries ago. You glance around the hall. Children sip weak ale from wooden cups, the liquid sloshing as they giggle. Servants guzzle more greedily, their cheeks flushed. The lord raises a goblet filled with something stronger, perhaps imported wine, but even he doesn't refuse the ale. It's the one drink that unites the castle, cutting across rank, age, and role. The noise rises higher now, the hall alive with chatter. Dogs bark beneath the tables, servants jostle for space, and the fire roars against the cold. All of it is softened by the steady presence of ale, a background hum of fermentation that has flowed through human history for centuries. You set down your cup, feel the slight buzz in your head, and smile. It's not about getting drunk, it's about staying alive, hydrated, and just a little happier in the face of endless snow. Ale isn't luxury here. It's routine, survival, and a kind of quiet joy poured into every wooden cup. The hall begins to quiet after the ale is poured, but at the lord's end of the table, servants carry in something more refined. The wooden cups of cloudy beer look humble compared to the gleaming pitchers now placed near the high dais. The liquid inside is darker, richer, and, in the dim light of the torches, almost glows ruby red. The lords and ladies murmur with anticipation as wine takes its turn to command the hall. One truth from the ledgers of wealthy castles is clear. Imported wine was the drink of status. Unlike ale, which could be brewed on site, wine often travelled hundreds of miles before reaching a northern fortress. Barrels arrived from France, Spain, or the Rhineland, carried by cart and river barge, then hauled across muddy tracks until they rattled into the cellar. To uncork a barrel in January was to announce wealth as much as taste. You watch as the steward inspects the casks stored in the castle's undercroft. The air is cool and damp, perfect for storage, though hardly as controlled as a modern cellar. Wooden staves creak, iron hoops rust, and the wine inside ages unevenly. Some barrels are sound, yielding deep and fruity flavours, while others have turned sour, their liquid closer to vinegar than vintage. And here lies a curious fact. Sour wine wasn't always wasted. Instead, it was mixed with water, herbs, or honey to make posset or spiced drinks, disguising flaws with sweetness or spice. In a world where nothing could be spared, Even spoiled wine had its role. Picture a servant sipping a cup of mulled wine that had more in common with vinegar punch, while nobles lifted goblets of the finer vintage. Yet historians still puzzle over how often nobles in northern Europe truly drank wine during long winters. Some argue that only the richest castles could afford steady supplies, while others note that even middling estates sometimes prioritized wine imports to display status during feasts. Did wine flow nightly, or was it rationed carefully for festivals and holy days? The surviving records don't fully agree. Back in the hall, the difference in rank is sharp. At the high table, goblets are silver or pewter, polished to catch the firelight. The wine is poured carefully, almost ceremonially. Down the hall, servants sip their small beer from wooden mugs, glancing occasionally at the red liquid gleaming above. The divide between ale and wine is more than taste, its hierarchy distilled into liquid form. You take a sip of the wine that has somehow made its way into your cup. It's sharp at first, slightly rough around the edges, but warmer than ale, heavier, filling your mouth with complexity. There's a faint note of smoke, perhaps from the barrels, and a sweetness underneath that surprises you. It tastes of faraway lands, of vineyards under sun rather than snow. In that moment, the hall feels less bleak. The kitchens contribute too, heating wine with spices into mulled drinks called hippocras. You hear the pestle grinding again, cloves and cinnamon cracked into powder, mixed with honey, then stirred into steaming cups. The scent spreads through the hall, and suddenly even the draughty space smells festive. The nobles smile more, their laughter louder, their cheeks red not just from fire but from strong drink. A quirky detail emerges here. In some households, spiced wine was so prized that it was served at the end of feasts as a kind of dessert, sweet and warming. Guests judged a host's generosity by the quality of hippocras offered. Imagine the pressure on a steward to ensure the final sip lingered pleasantly, sending guests home with memories not of the cold but of honeyed warmth. Meanwhile, in the storerooms, servants must guard the barrels carefully. Wine casks leak, crack, or are pilfered by thirsty workers. To prevent loss, some stewards sealed barrels with wax or stationed guards at the cellar door. Each missing cup was an insult to the lord's wealth, so the responsibility weighed heavily. You picture a kitchen boy sneaking a taste from a tap, only to find himself whipped for daring to steal a drop of status. Yet for all its glamour, wine was fickle. Unlike beer, it didn't always last through the winter. By February, the best casks might be gone, leaving only sour remnants. The contrast between December's rich hippocras and March's thin, vinegary dregs must have been disheartening. Still, nobles insisted on maintaining wine stocks, even when importing them strained the estate's purse. To be without wine was to admit weakness. The debate among specialists continues. Did wine genuinely become a staple at noble tables, or was it always a luxury reserved for display? Some argue that northern castles gradually integrated it into daily meals, while others maintain it was ceremonial, consumed only in limited quantities. Whatever the case, its symbolic power cannot be denied. Back in the hall, you cradle your cup, feeling the warmth of the drink spread through your chest. The chatter grows louder, the shadows feel softer, and for a moment, you forget the ice pressing at the walls. Wine is more than drink, it's illusion, a transformation of atmosphere. It brings a taste of vineyards into a world of snow, a sense of abundance where scarcity rules. Servants clear the tables now, carrying away empty goblets and mugs. Dogs lick at spilled drops, their tongues stained faintly red. The fire crackles louder, the hall buzzing with contentment. You set down your cup and feel a brief calm wash over you, as though the castle itself has exhaled. Wine may not last the winter. It may sour, spoil, or vanish into thirsty mouths. But for the nights when it flows, it brings with it more than nourishment. It brings spectacle, warmth, and a fleeting sense that the world beyond the snow is still within reach. The fire flickers lower, casting long shadows on the stone walls, but the meal is not yet finished. After salted meat, cabbage stews, and even the sharp burn of wine, another craving creeps forward: sweetness. In a world without refined sugar, that craving is satisfied by one golden treasure: honey. You watch as a servant carries in a clay pot, its lid sealed with wax. When it is cracked open, the smell is unmistakable: floral, rich, and thick with promise. One certainty from medieval sources is that honey was the primary sweetener of Europe before sugar became widespread. Every castle that could keep bees did so, often in wicker skeps placed near gardens or orchards. The honey collected in summer was stored carefully, dripped into pots, and hoarded like treasure. In the cold of January, a spoonful of it was more than food. It was comfort, medicine, and luxury in equal measure. You dip your finger into the sticky liquid and taste. It coats your tongue, heavy and slow, clinging longer than wine or ale. For a moment, it feels like sunlight stored in edible form, a reminder of buzzing summer fields long buried under snow. Its sweetness is almost overwhelming after weeks of salted and sour flavors. A curious little twist emerges here. Beeswax, the byproduct of honey, was just as valuable. It became candles for the chapel, salves for cracked skin, and even polish for armor. In a sense, the hive fed both body and soul, offering sweetness and light during the darkest months. But the scale of honey use in castles remains debated. Some historians suggest honey was plentiful in rural estates, available even to lower ranks, while others argue it was carefully rationed, reserved for noble tables and medicine chests. Did the scullions ever taste it? Or did they watch enviously as golden drops disappeared into the Lord's custard? The answer shifts depending on the records, leaving us with a sweet uncertainty. Beyond honey itself lay its spirited cousin, mead. You hear the sound of clay cups clinking, the liquid inside a golden amber. Mead was honey fermented into alcohol, producing a drink both sweet and intoxicating. Unlike ale, which was weak and everyday, mead carried a hint of festivity, often reserved for feasts and celebrations. In winter, when joy felt scarce, a cup of mead lifted spirits higher than most foods could manage. The taste of mead is rich, thicker than wine, sweet yet sharp with fermentation. You imagine servants whispering prayers of thanks when the steward opened a cask, knowing that the night ahead would be warmer, louder, and happier. Mead was more than drink. It was mood, capable of transforming a silent hall into a buzzing hive of laughter. The kitchens knew countless ways to use honey beyond drink: drizzle it on fresh cheese to disguise sourness, stir it into pottage for the sick, mix it with herbs to make syrup for coughs. Honey was medicine as much as indulgence, prescribed by physicians for everything from sore throats to melancholy. Imagine swallowing a spoonful by the fire, your chest easing not only from the sweetness but from the belief that it carried healing within it. At the high table, the experiments grew more elaborate. Honey cakes, spiced with cinnamon if the larder permitted, custards thickened with eggs, sweetened with golden syrup, even roasted meats glazed in honey, gleaming under the torchlight. Each dish sent a message. This household could turn survival into pleasure, even in the middle of January. Meanwhile, at the lower tables, the sweetness came rarely. A dollop of honey stirred into porridge for a child, or a lick of wax scraped from a jar by a tired servant. Yet even those tiny tastes lingered, memorable in ways that salted beef never could. Sweetness was an event. What might surprise you is how honey also carried symbolic weight. Monks kept bees in cloisters, linking honey to purity and spiritual light. Honey appeared in wedding feasts, as a blessing of fertility. It even inspired the term honeymoon, when couples drank mead to sweeten the first month of marriage. Every golden drop carried cultural echoes beyond its taste. The cellar tells its own story. Pots of honey stored carefully in cool darkness, lids sealed with wax, each one watched closely by the steward. Spoilage was rare, honey resists decay, but theft was common. Sweetness tempted even the most obedient servant, and punishments for stealing honey could be harsh. Imagine the risk of dipping a spoon into the pot, knowing discovery meant a whipping, but temptation winning anyway. Scholars continue to debate just how often honey and mead appeared in daily castle life. Were they occasional treats or regular companions at the table? The evidence is patchy, but the symbolism endures. Honey meant hope, sweetness against the bitter cold, light in the darkness. You take another sip of mead, the warmth spreading through you. The hall seems brighter, laughter louder, and even the dogs beg happily at the edges of the table. For a little while, the monotony of salted meat and sour ale is forgotten. Sweetness has its way of reshaping memory, making the night feel softer than it really island. The fire pops, sending sparks upward. Servants clear bowls sticky with honey. Children lick their fingers, and the Lord smiles with satisfaction. The snow still falls outside, relentless as ever, but in here, golden liquid has created a bubble of warmth and joy. Honey doesn't fill bellies like bread, nor does it preserve like salt, but in the middle of winter, it offers something just as essential: delight. And sometimes, delight is what keeps the cold at bay long enough for morning to come. The honey jars are sealed once more and carried back to storage, but another sound breaks the lull of the hall: the cackle of hens. You turn toward the corner where wicker baskets sit, straw spilling from their edges. A boy pulls out a small clutch of eggs, his hands careful as though holding gems. In winter, those fragile shells are rarer than saffron threads, each one a small miracle in the frozen months. It's well established that hens lay far fewer eggs during winter. Short days, cold temperatures, and limited forage slow their production almost to nothing. A household might gather dozens daily in summer, but by January, only a handful appear in the baskets. Each egg becomes precious, counted, rationed, and often reserved for the Lord's family or for the sick. You cradle one in your palm and feel its weight. Imagine the excitement when a servant cracks an egg in mid-January, the yolk sliding into a custard or tart. For a moment, the bleakness outside doesn't matter. Protein, richness, and colour all wrapped in a fragile shell bring variety to otherwise monotonous meals. An unexpected quirk surfaces here. Some estates stored eggs by coating them in wax, lime water, or ashes, extending their life weeks beyond normal. The results weren't always pleasant rubbery whites, odd flavours, but in desperate times, they were edible. You picture a servant cracking into an egg that had been buried in lime since October, wrinkling his nose, but swallowing gratefully anyway. But scholars remain divided over how widespread these preservation techniques really were. Were lime water eggs a common sight in castle kitchens, or were they experimental practices mentioned rarely because of mixed success? Some argue that preserved eggs appear more in theory than reality, while others point to estate records that hint at their importance in rationing. The evidence leaves a shadow of doubt hanging over the practice. The kitchen smells different when eggs appear. The cook whisks yolks into almond milk, sugar, and spices to make a custard for the high table. The colour glows golden in the dim firelight, a rare brightness in January. Nobles savour it with small spoons, each mouthful smooth and sweet. For them, an egg dish is not just nourishment but spectacle, proof that the castle can still afford delicacy in lean times. Meanwhile, down at the servants' tables, eggs rarely appear in bowls. Perhaps a scrap mixed into pottage on feast days, or a broken egg stirred into dough for bread. More often, the lower ranks simply watched as eggs disappeared into the Lord's kitchen, their chance to taste one gone with the crack of a shell. Children, however, sometimes fared better. Accounts describe eggs saved for the youngest or the sick, mixed into warm milk or broth to build strength. Imagine a child clutching a wooden cup, sipping a mixture of egg and honey, their face brightening with every swallow. In a world of scarcity, that cup could feel like medicine and miracle combined. The hens themselves deserve a glance. You picture them huddled in coops lined with straw, feathers fluffed against the cold. Grain scattered sparingly keeps them alive, but foxes prowl near the walls, and the bird's survival is never certain. Every cluck, every egg laid, carries a whisper of relief for the steward counting supplies. Another curious note: in some traditions, eggs symbolized rebirth and resurrection, long before Easter customs solidified. To crack one open in the dead of winter was to taste the promise of spring, a reminder that life persisted even when snow buried the fields. Superstition, faith, and hunger blurred into one as people treated eggs with reverence beyond their size. You lift a spoonful of custard and taste. It's silky, warm, scented faintly with nutmeg. The sweetness coats your mouth. The richness lingers. It feels decadent, even slightly illicit. After so many bowls of cabbage and barley, you understand why nobles guarded eggs so fiercely. They carried joy in fragile shells. But as the bowls are cleared, you see how quickly the miracle fades. There are no baskets full of eggs to replace what was eaten tonight. Only a few remain, guarded carefully in the steward's records, their fate already decided. The lower tables return to bread and ale, their hands empty of yolks. The uncertainty continues among historians. Were eggs truly as scarce in all regions? Or did larger estates with better coops manage steadier supplies? Did nobles exaggerate their rarity to heighten the drama of their meals? These questions hover unresolved, like hens clucking faintly in the background of winter life. In the hall, the torches dim, and the servants carry the custard bowls away. You lean back, the taste still fresh on your tongue. It is a fleeting luxury, yes, but one that lights the gloom for a few moments. You realize that in a castle where survival often meant chewing through salt and cabbage, a single egg could carry the weight of hope. The snow outside thickens, the night deepens, and you picture the hens settling into straw, their clucks soft, their eyes half closed. Somewhere in the dark, one might lay a new egg by morning. And in this world of scarcity, that small sound could mean the difference between despair and delight. The clucking of hens fades into the background, replaced now by a different sound, the distant bark of hounds and the hollow call of horns echoing from the frozen woods. In the dead of winter, when salted stores grow monotonous, the Lord's household looks outward for something fresher game. Hunting was not merely a pastime, it was a declaration of power, a reminder that the Lord commanded both land and life. A fact that survives clearly in medieval records is that winter hunts provided crucial bursts of fresh meat. Deer, wild boar, and sometimes even bears filled the larders when the stores began to dwindle. Hunting was restricted by law and privilege. Peasants caught poaching risked hanging or mutilation, but the lord and his retinue could ride out at will, claiming the forests as their pantry. You picture the scene. Snow crunches under hooves, hounds snarl and bay, horns blare through the frosty air. The hunters cloaked in fur press into the woods with spears and bows. Breath clouds rise like smoke, mixing with the fog of the forest. The silence breaks with a shout as the hounds pick up the scent, and soon the chase thunders forward. For the Lord it is sport, spectacle, and demonstration of authority. For everyone else in the castle, it is food. A curious note surfaces from chronicles. Sometimes animals were parked in enclosed hunting reserves, making hunts less wild chase and more staged performance. Deer herds were semi-managed, ensuring the Lord always had something to kill when guests visited. Imagine calling it hunting, when the animals were practically waiting behind wooden fences. It was as much theatre as sustenance. Yet historians still argue over how significant these hunts were to the castle's winter diet. Some claim they were occasional luxuries, adding glamour to feasts but not sustaining the household in the long term. Others insist that regular hunts, especially for deer and boar, contributed meaningful amounts of fresh meat through the coldest months. The truth is difficult to pin down, shaped by region, wealth, and the Lord's appetite for both food and spectacle. Back in the kitchens, the results arrive. A stag, massive and steaming in the frosty air, is hauled across the stones. Its hide glistens, its blood dark against the snow. Butchery begins quickly, knives flashing, steam rising. The smell of iron fills the room, stronger than anything salted. Cuts are sorted, haunches for roasting, organs for stews, scraps for pies. Nothing is wasted, because fresh meat in January is treasure. The great hall erupts that evening when the venison arrives at the high table, roasted, basted with dripping, spiced with pepper if available. It is carved in front of the guests with ceremony. The meat is darker, richer, and far juicier than anything hauled from a barrel of brine. The Lord beams, knife glinting, as if to say, "Look, my lands still provide." Down the hall, servants and guards receive smaller portions, bone stews, perhaps a slice or two of venison pie, flavoured with whatever scraps remain. Still, even a taste of fresh game is a delight after months of salted pork. Children gnaw bones eagerly, sucking marrow, their fingers slick with grease. Dogs fight beneath the table for scraps, tails wagging furiously. One odd custom appears in some records: the head of a boar, roasted whole and decorated with herbs or even gilded, was presented at Christmas feasts. It wasn't just food, it was pageantry, a symbol of ferocity conquered and wealth displayed. You imagine the stunned faces of guests as servants carry in a boar's head crowned with rosemary, tusks polished, an apple stuffed in its mouth. Half horror, half wonder, all designed to remind everyone of the Lord's dominance. The hunt also carried risks. A boar could gore a man easily, a deer could trample hunters, and icy forests held dangers of their own. Injuries were common, sometimes fatal. The glamour of roasted venison hid the fact that each cut of meat might have cost blood on the snow. In that sense, hunting was more than sport, it was risk turned into feast, danger swallowed into strength. Scholars remain divided about whether these hunts truly alleviated hunger or simply heightened spectacle. Was the venison stew at the servants' end of the hall enough to stretch the larders, or was it a one-night feast quickly forgotten when bread and cabbage returned? The debate lingers like smoke from the hearth, unresolved but evocative. You lean over your trencher and take a bite of roasted venison. It's tender compared to salted beef, the juices soaking into bread, the flavour wild and earthy. It tastes of pine and frost, of the forest itself carried into the hall. The warmth spreads quickly, a reminder of what food can be when not bent beneath preservation. The mood in the hall swells. Ale and wine flow more freely, laughter bursts louder, and songs rise. For a night, the castle forgets scarcity. Fresh game is not only nourishment but morale, a reminder that life can still surprise with abundance. As the plates empty, bones are thrown to the dogs, platters scraped clean. Servants carry trays of leftovers to the kitchens, where scraps will become tomorrow's pottage. Nothing is wasted, because tomorrow the feast fades back into routine, and salted barrels again define survival. You glance at the fire, see sparks leap, and realize the symbolism. The hunt is the Lord's declaration that the wilderness still bends to his will, that the forest can be turned into meat even in January. But beneath the pageantry lies a simpler truth. Without that fresh venison, hunger gnaws sharper, monotony thickens, and hope grows thinner. The horns outside fall silent. The hounds curl by the kitchen fire, bellies full. Snow still buries the world, but tonight the castle tastes the forest's gift. Fresh meat, risk and reward alike, has carried everyone one step closer to spring. The memory of the hunt still lingers in the hall. The scent of roasted venison, the echo of horns fading into the woods. But not every household could depend solely on deer and boar to keep bellies full. You glance again toward the kitchens, where cages and coops reveal another strategy of survival. Here, the animals are smaller, tamer, and far more reliable than any stag in the forest. Rabbits, pigeons, and even the occasional swan. Household records make one thing certain. Managed game was a cornerstone of castle diets, especially during the bleakest winter weeks. Unlike the uncertain hunt, rabbits bred in controlled warrens, pigeons flocked predictably in dovecotes, and swans floated on ponds reserved exclusively for the Lord's table. These creatures provided fresh meat when barrels of salted beef felt endless and wild hunts proved too dangerous in snow and ice. You picture the rabbit warrens first. Small earthen enclosures lined with wooden fences or stone walls, filled with rabbits darting in and out of burrows. They might seem wild at a glance, but they were managed, tended, and sometimes even branded with cuts in their ears to mark ownership. When food was needed, servants snared a few and carried them into the kitchen, their soft fur soon giving way to stew pots. And here's a curious detail. Rabbit meat was considered particularly delicate, suited for pies or roasted joints at the high table. Some sources suggest that cooks stuffed rabbits with herbs and dried fruit, turning humble game into luxury. Down at the servants' end, however, the same rabbits became bone stews. The flavor stretched as far as possible with vegetables and bread. Two very different meals, drawn from the same creature. But specialists still argue over how widespread these warrens were. Were they common in all castles, or limited to the richest estates with space and labor to manage them? Some archaeologists point to remains of elaborate warren structures, while others note their absence in many regions. The picture is patchy, leaving us to imagine rabbits hopping in some courtyards while absent in others. Pigeons, too, provided steady sustenance. Dovecotes' tower-like structures, filled with hundreds of nesting niches, stood as symbols of privilege. Only lords had the right to keep flocks that large, and their presence was more than ornamental. Pigeon meat, though small, was tender and tasty, and pigeon dung was prized as fertilizer. You walk past the dovecote now and hear the flutter of wings, the low cooing of birds that know no winter scarcity. The kitchen receives pigeons daily, enough to prepare pies or stews for the high table. You imagine one of the famous medieval delicacies, a pigeon pie with a decorative crust, steam escaping through holes shaped like birds. Guests would marvel at the presentation before digging in, impressed not only by the taste but by the display of wealth that keeping pigeons represented. Servants further down the hall might receive only the bony remains, boiled into broth. Then there are swans stranger still to modern taste, but considered delicacies in the medieval world. To serve a roasted swan at a winter feast was to make a statement. The bird often arrived at the high table redressed in its own feathers for show, as if to say, "This is not only meat, but majesty itself." You picture the stunned hush in the hall as the gleaming bird is carried forward, its long neck arched, its feathers gleaming with gilded tips. It is spectacle as much as nourishment. Yet questions remain. How often were swans actually eaten? Some argue they were largely ceremonial, trotted out for Christmas or weddings rather than daily fare. Others point to estate accounts that list swan keepers, suggesting the birds were maintained regularly. The reality may have shifted from castle to castle, with some households seeing swan as rare pageantry and others as a recurring dish. Back in the kitchen, the smells of roasting rabbit, stewing pigeon, and basting swan mingle strangely. The fat drips, the herbs crackle, and the air thickens with scents far fresher than salted pork. Servants rush to prepare sauces, pepper, vinegar, or even almond milk mixtures to elevate the flavor further. The clatter of pans and the flutter of feathers remind you that meat doesn't always come from barrels or hunts. Sometimes it is cultivated right in the castle yard. You take a bite of rabbit pie, the crust flaky, the filling rich with meat, onions, and perhaps a few dried currants. The flavor is delicate, lighter than venison, yet satisfying. Another spoonful of pigeon stew follows stronger, gamier, but warming. At last, a morsel of swan, tougher than expected, but flavored with spices that make it taste more exotic than its island. Each bite tells the same story. Survival, but dressed differently depending on rank. What might amuse you is that swan, despite its grandeur, was often less tasty than rabbit or pigeon. Some diners described it as greasy or stringy, more impressive on the table than in the mouth. Yet that didn't matter, the spectacle outweighed the flavor. To serve swan was to prove status, even if the guests secretly preferred rabbit. The servants eat more humbly. Their stew contains rabbit bones, pigeon wings, scraps of offal. Still, the broth is rich, fresher than salted meat, and they slurp it with gratitude. Children gnaw pigeon bones, their cheeks sticky with grease. Dogs snapping eagerly beneath their feet. For them, these smaller animals are not symbols, they are calories, warmth, and strength against the cold. Scholars still puzzle over whether the lower ranks of a castle regularly tasted these creatures. Were they rare treats handed down as leftovers, or were warrens and dovecots productive enough to feed everyone? The truth is uncertain, lost in incomplete accounts. But it is easy to imagine scraps of pigeon stew trickling down, bones sucked clean by those who rarely tasted fresh flesh. The hall fills again with noise, cups clinking, laughter rising. Tonight, the castle feels more alive than yesterday, more varied in its meals, more hopeful in its mood. Rabbits, pigeons, and swans may not rival venison in grandeur, but they provide what salted stores cannot: variety, freshness, and the illusion of abundance in midwinter. You glance at the steward's records, his quill scratching across parchment. Every rabbit counted, every pigeon noted, every swan tracked. For him, these creatures are not just food but arithmetic, another calculation in the endless effort to stretch supplies until spring. The torch is dim, the hall grows quieter, but your belly is warmer than before. You realize that survival in a medieval castle wasn't only about barrels of salted meat or sacks of grain. It was also about clever management of smaller lives, soft-furred, feathered, and sometimes regal. Each creature brought closer the hope that snow would one day melt and fields would turn green again. The smell of roasting swan lingers faintly in the rafters, but as the laughter quiets and the fire burns lower, attention shifts to a different kind of store. The heavy barrels and salt cellars have their place, but hidden in sacks and baskets are treasures that carry a different sweetness. You follow a servant down into the storerooms again, where the air smells of dust, wood, and something faintly fruity. Here lie the preserved fruits, dried and wrinkled, but still carrying the memory of summer. Estate records confirm that fruit preservation was common in medieval castles. Apples, pears, plums, and sometimes cherries were dried in late summer and packed away for winter. They were strung on cords, laid out in cloth sacks, or stored in wooden boxes with layers of straw. Their skins shrank, their flesh toughened, but they remained edible, offering a burst of sweetness long after the orchards froze bare. You pick up a dried apple slice. It's leathery, darker than fresh, but when you bite, the flavor is surprisingly strong tart, concentrated, with a hint of smoke from the drying process. It clings to your teeth, sticky, but the taste carries sunlight, orchards, and warmth into the frozen depths of January. There's a curious note that pops up in household manuals. Some cooks soaked dried fruits in wine or ale before cooking, plumping them back into softness. Imagine a servant stirring dried pears into a simmering pot, the fruit swelling as the steam rises. For nobles, these dishes might appear as spiced compotes, pies, or sauces to accompany meat. For servants, the same fruit might sweeten pottage, turning thin stew into something closer to dessert. Yet uncertainty remains. Did the majority of households manage to store dried fruit in sufficient quantities, or was it too labor-intensive to rely on? Some scholars argue that fruit was mostly eaten fresh in autumn, with little surviving into winter except in wealthy estates. Others insist that drying and preserving were widespread, pointing to archaeological evidence of fruit pits and skins found in storage pits. The truth likely varies, leaving us with a patchwork picture of winter diets. The kitchen tonight glows with new smells. Dried plums are simmered into a thick sauce, poured over roasted rabbit to add tartness. Apples are baked in pastry, the crust golden and flaky, the fruit soft and spiced with cinnamon if the pantry allows. The nobles at the high table lean closer, savouring flavours that remind them of gardens now buried under frost. Down the hall, the servants receive simpler fare. Slices of dried apple stirred into hot porridge, their sweetness spreading thin across a dozen bowls. Children chew noisily, delighted by the treat, even if their portion is only a single piece softened in broth. To them, fruit is not garnish or luxury, it is pure delight, a rare change from cabbage and salt. A quirky practice sometimes noted is the creation of fruit pastes, early versions of what you might think of as jam or jelly. Apples or quinces were boiled down into thick, sticky slabs, then stored in jars or cut into blocks. These pastes kept surprisingly well and could be sliced onto bread during the long winter. Picture nibbling a square of dark, sticky fruit paste in February, the taste transporting you back to harvest days. But fruit wasn't just food, it was also medicine. Physicians recommended dried plums to ease digestion, pears for cooling fevers, and apples to balance the humors. To nibble on dried fruit was to trust in both nourishment and cure, even when the science was more faith than fact. You sip from a small cup of pear syrup tonight and feel the warmth spread, placebo or not. The hall grows fragrant as a plum sauce is served with pigeon pie. The aroma mixes sweet and savory, confusing your senses at first, but then soothing them. Medieval cooks loved this contrast meat with fruit, salt with sugar flavors that felt exotic to palates dulled by winter monotony. You chew, surprised at how well the tart fruit cuts the grease, turning necessity into innovation. And yet, scholars still discuss whether this sweet-savory pairing was everyday fare or occasional extravagance. Did the Lord truly eat pigeon in plum sauce weekly, or was this more festival than routine? The uncertainty lingers, like the faint tang of apple still clinging to your tongue. The storerooms hold their own poetry. You walk past sacks of wrinkled pears, cords of apples strung like garlands, plums pressed flat and sticky. Each one is a small defiance against scarcity, proof that summer can echo even in snow. The steward guards them carefully, doling them out sparingly, because each bite is morale as much as nutrition. Children sit by the hearth, nibbling dried apple slices, their faces sticky, their laughter rising. Servants share plum broth, smiling at the sweetness. At the high table, nobles lift cups of spiced wine laced with raisins, sipping as though tasting summer itself. For a moment, all levels of the castle share the same memory. Orchards heavy with fruit, sunlight filtering through leaves, fields golden with warmth. The snow howls outside, but inside, fruit whispers of seasons to come. You chew another piece, leathery and tart, and feel your mouth flood with the ghost of August. Survival isn't just about salt and bread, it's also about memory, carried in every wrinkled slice. The taste of dried apples still lingers faintly, but soon the servants bring forward another kind of preserved treasure. This time there are no sweet aromas of orchards, no tart sauces bubbling in pans. Instead, the air fills with the nutty, earthy scent of cracked shells. Bowls of hazelnuts, walnuts, and sometimes chestnuts are set down along the long tables. The sound shifts in the hall too. Instead of knives scraping trenchers, you hear the steady crack of shells against the edge of wooden bowls, followed by the crunch of teeth. Household accounts and archaeological finds both confirm that nuts were a reliable source of calories during winter. They stored easily in sacks or baskets, their hard shells protecting the kernels inside for months. Rich in fat and protein, they provided energy when vegetables were scarce and meat was rationed. Hazelnuts grew abundantly in Europe, walnuts thrived where climates allowed, and chestnuts offered starch in regions where they flourished. In castles, these humble foods were both snack and supplement, bridging gaps when larders ran thin. You reach into a bowl and pull out a walnut. The shell is rough, ridged like old stone, but when cracked open, the flesh inside gleams pale and oily. The flavor is rich, slightly bitter but satisfying. After weeks of salted meat and cabbage, the taste feels surprisingly fresh, a small reminder of forests and autumn harvests. A curious practice is recorded in some kitchens. Nuts were not only eaten plain, but also ground into sauces. Almond milk, a common substitute for dairy during Lent or fast days, was made by pounding almonds into paste and mixing them with water. The liquid strained off was used to thicken soups or sweeten stews. Imagine a January meal where your pottage, instead of tasting of salt and roots, is enriched with a creamy almond-based luxury hiding inside a nut. Yet there is debate among scholars about how widely nuts were used across social classes. Were almonds, imported from warmer regions, available only to nobles, while peasants and servants made do with hazelnuts and walnuts? Or did trade networks make almonds surprisingly common in castle kitchens, even if only in small amounts? The evidence splits, leaving us to wonder whether the servant at the lower table ever tasted the almond broth that nobles considered ordinary. The hall tonight grows noisier, as hands crack shells, nuts flying across tables, laughter rising at every failed attempt to split one cleanly. Children chase rolling hazelnuts on the floor, dogs snapping them up eagerly. For the poor, a handful of nuts could be dinner in itself, paired with bread or porridge. For the wealthy, nuts elevated dishes into something refined. Chestnuts, in particular, carried their own traditions. In some regions, they were roasted on open fires, the shells popping, the smell sweet and smoky. You imagine servants gathering near the hearth, passing around hot chestnuts, their hands warming against the shell. The taste is softer than other nuts, more starchy, almost like bread in miniature. A handful could quiet hunger as effectively as a bowl of pottage. What might surprise you is how often nuts appeared in desserts. Medieval cooks blended ground almonds with honey to make marzipan, a delicacy molded into shapes of animals or castles, then gilded with gold leaf for feasts. Imagine biting into a sweet almond castle while sitting in a real one, the symbolism both playful and proud. Down below, servants might nibble plain hazelnuts, unaware of the artistry happening at the dais. Nuts also served practical purposes beyond food. Walnut oil could be pressed for lamps, and nutshells were sometimes burned as kindling. Even the shells had value, recycled into fuel when firewood ran short. Nothing was wasted, because winter punished waste harshly. But here too lies uncertainty. Did nuts make up a substantial part of winter calories, or were they more supplement than staple? Some researchers argue that nuts were plentiful enough to be common snacks, while others insist their role was minor, overshadowed by bread and pottage. The truth may rest in the middle, not primary sustenance, but welcome variety. The kitchen tonight smells of almond paste. You watch a cook grind nuts with a mortar and pestle, his arms straining as the paste softens under pressure. The scent is creamy, faintly sweet, filling the air with something far richer than salted pork. He stirs it into a sauce for fish, turning a briny dish into something elegant. At the high table, nobles dip bread into it, nodding with pleasure. At the servants' end, hazelnuts crack between teeth, laughter rising in rhythm with the crunch. You crack another walnut and chew slowly. The flavor is earthy, grounding, reminding you of forests outside the castle walls, silent now under snow but still alive in memory. Each bite is more than sustenance. It is connection to land, harvest, and continuity. Nuts endure when other foods vanish, their shells tiny fortresses against hunger. The snow howls outside, rattling shutters, but inside the hall, the crack of shells and the crunch of teeth echo like music. From noble almond sauces to servants' handfuls of hazelnuts, the castle chews together, briefly united by the taste of forest harvests. As you finish your handful, you realize something simple yet profound. Bread might fill the stomach, salted meat might preserve life, but nuts bring resilience. In their small, unassuming shells, they hold both calories and comfort, quietly carrying the castle one step closer to spring. The laughter over cracked nuts fades, and soon the hall grows quieter again. The staples of survival bread, salted pork, cabbage, pottage always return, but tonight the steward has chosen to remind everyone that the castle's reach extends far beyond its stone walls. A pair of servants stagger in with crates, each stamped with foreign markings, the wood bound tight with iron nails. When the lids are pried open, a burst of scent fills the air, sweet, sharp, and unmistakably foreign. imported luxuries have arrived. The historical record leaves little doubt. Wealthy castles participated in long-distance trade networks that stretched across continents. Even in the depths of European winter, nobles might taste almonds from the Mediterranean, figs from the Levant, raisins from Spain, or oranges from southern groves. To display such goods was to display wealth, connections, and sophistication. While common folk outside the castle chewed on black bread, the lord's table glittered with fruit that had travelled hundreds of miles. You lean forward as a servant peels an orange, the skin releasing a cloud of fragrant oil into the air. The fruit glows like fire in the dim hall, its segments gleaming against the grey stone. In January, such colour is almost shocking, a reminder that somewhere beyond the snow, the sun still ripens fruit. You bite into a slice, and the tang floods your mouth, sweet and sour at once, so fresh it almost hurts. An unusual practice emerges in some accounts. Imported almonds were turned into almond milk, thickened with rice flour, then sweetened with honey or sugar if available. The result was a creamy pudding, often dyed with saffron to appear golden. Imagine dipping your spoon into a bowl of this dish while outside the wind scoured the battlements. To eat such food was to defy winter itself. But there is disagreement among scholars about how common these imports were. Some argue they appeared only at the grandest feasts, rare and precious enough to be remembered in chronicles. Others suggest they were steady features of noble households that had reliable trade connections. Did nobles sip almond milk daily in January? Or was it a performance rolled out only when guests needed to be impressed? The records leave room for both interpretations. The kitchen tonight is chaos. Servants pound almonds in mortars until they collapse into pale paste. Dried figs are sliced, sticky and sweet, leaving knives coated in syrup. A cook carefully sprinkles saffron threads into a sauce, watching the liquid turn a dazzling yellow. The scents blend strangely: citrus sharpness, nutty creaminess, the floral tang of saffron. The room feels less like a medieval kitchen and more like a miniature crossroads of the world. At the high table, the nobles receive delicate dishes: rice flavoured with almond milk, raisins folded into spiced wine, figs stuffed with walnuts and honey. Their plates shine with colour, rare for January, every bite reminding guests that their host commands not only land but trade routes. For them, food is diplomacy as much as sustenance. Down the hall, the servants smell it all but taste little. Perhaps a stray raisin falls their way, or a spoonful of sauce slips down from the kitchen. Mostly, they watch, chew their black bread, and dream of the day when even a fig might appear in their bowl. For them, imported goods are legends more than realities. What might surprise you is that some of these exotic ingredients doubled as medicine. Oranges were thought to cleanse the body, figs to strengthen digestion, almonds to sharpen the mind. To nibble on a raisin was not only indulgence but also cure, at least according to the physicians. The blurred line between medicine and luxury made every imported bite carry extra meaning. Another curious tidbit: sugar, still rare in much of Europe, arrived in small loaves or cones, shaved into powder with knives. To sprinkle even a pinch over a dish was extravagance. Nobles treated sugar almost like a spice rather than a staple, using it sparingly but proudly. You imagine the astonished faces of guests when a custard arrived, not only golden with saffron, but dusted with actual sugar crystals, glittering in candlelight like jewels. The debate among historians continues here as well. Were such imports genuinely enjoyed for their taste, or were they valued mainly for the status they projected? Some evidence suggests nobles praised dishes not because they were delicious but because they demonstrated wealth. After all, a wrinkled fig after weeks in a barrel might not taste extraordinary, but its presence alone was enough to impress. You lift a fig to your lips and chew slowly. It's dense, chewy, sweet to the point of stickiness. Seeds crunch between your teeth, and the taste clings stubbornly to your tongue. It isn't fresh fruit, but it is different, and that difference feels like a gift. Around you, The nobles nod appreciatively, their cups raised in toasts to the distant merchants who made it possible. The hall smells brighter tonight, more alive, as if the imported goods carry not only flavor, but atmosphere. Candlelight reflects off silver dishes, laughter echoes louder, and for a moment, the castle seems less grey. Food has transported everyone, if only briefly, to lands where snow never falls. But as the dishes are cleared, reality presses back in. Only a handful of crates remain, guarded carefully in the storerooms. The steward knows that each almond, each fig, must last for weeks, rationed carefully to stretch until spring. The servants return to their bread. The nobles sip their last drops of spiced wine, and the cold air sneaks back into the hall. Still, you can't shake the memory of that orange slice bursting against your tongue, sharp and sweet all at once. Imported luxuries may not fill bellies the way bread or pottage do, but they feed something else: imagination, morale, the belief that life is bigger than the snow pressing against the gates. As you lean back, the scent of saffron still faint in your nose, you understand why lords spent fortunes on these goods. In a season of monotony, they provided not only nourishment but narrative stories of faraway lands, proof of wealth, whispers of spring. The hall falls into a quieter rhythm after the last figs are cleared away. The nobles lean back in their chairs, their bellies warm with spiced wine, while the servants carry scraps into the kitchens for tomorrow's pottage. Yet even now, the steward prepares something different for those who are unwell or weary. Not every bowl in a medieval castle was filled with food for feasting. Some carried medicine disguised as supper. Tonight, you are offered a steaming cup of broth, a concoction meant as much to heal as to feed. One fact recorded repeatedly in medical treatises and household manuals is that broths formed the foundation of medieval dietary medicine. Physicians and cooks believed that bones, herbs, and simmered vegetables released not only nourishment but also curative powers. A simple pot of bone broth with leeks could be prescribed to strengthen the weak, ease a fever, or balance the humours. In winter, when illness struck more readily and hunger weakened bodies, these restorative broths were lifelines. You hold the cup close to your lips, the steam curling upward. The smell is earthy onion, parsley, perhaps a sprig of thyme dried from summer. Beneath it is the faint richness of bone marrow, simmered for hours until the liquid turned golden. When you sip, it coats your throat, soothing in ways salted beef never could. It is thin, yes, but warm, gentle and comforting, as if the cook ladled hope straight into your hands. A curious practice surfaces in some recipes. Herbs and spices weren't added just for flavor, but for their supposed medicinal properties. Cinnamon to warm the body, fennel to ease the stomach, sage to sharpen the mind. Imagine sipping a broth spiced with nutmeg in the dead of January, believing each sip not only nourished you but also kept plague at bay. Food and medicine blurred until every bowl was both supper and prescription. But historians still wrestle with the question: were these broths truly consumed by all levels of society, or were they reserved mostly for the noble family and the sick? Some evidence suggests that stewards recorded extra herbs and almond milk purchases specifically for the lord's table, indicating exclusivity. Others argue that since bones and vegetable scraps were common, simple broths must have been available to everyone, though perhaps less fragrant than those laced with saffron or ginger. The lack of clarity leaves us peering into steaming bowls without knowing whose lips most often touched them. In the kitchen, you watch the process unfold. Bones crackle as they're dropped into boiling water, onions sizzling before they soften, herbs crumbled between rough hands. The cooks move with calm precision, stirring gently, skimming froth from the surface. The sound of bubbling fills the room, steady as a heartbeat. Servants nearby inhale deeply, their faces softening as the aroma promises warmth. At the high table, the broth appears in ceramic bowls, sometimes thickened with almond milk or rice flour to give it body. Nobles sip delicately, convinced of its healing powers. Down the hall, a thinner version is poured into wooden cups, drunk quickly before returning to labor. The same concept stretches across ranks, comfort in liquid form, but the ingredients differ, reflecting hierarchy even in illness. What might surprise you is the ritual attached to these broths. Chronicles describe how some households served them to women after childbirth, to old men in winter, or to children recovering from sickness. The act of serving broth was as symbolic as it was practical. It declared that the castle cared for its vulnerable, that life was guarded even when death pressed close in the frost. Another odd note: some prescriptions recommended broth made from unlikely ingredients, pigeon hearts, swan fat, or even powdered pearls dissolved in hot liquid for the wealthiest. Did these work? Likely not. But they reinforced the belief that healing could be swallowed, that the right mixture of food and faith could restore strength. You sip again, letting the warmth slide into your stomach. The broth doesn't fill you like bread or meat, but it steadies you, reminding you that survival isn't only about calories. It's about comfort, care, and the belief that tomorrow can still be faced. In a castle where cold and hunger stalk every corner, that belief might be as important as the food itself. The debate continues among scholars. Should we see these medicinal broths as genuine healthcare or simply extensions of culinary routine? Some point to physicians' manuals that prescribe broth for nearly every ailment, evidence of real medical practice. Others argue it was little more than everyday cooking dressed in fancy theory. Whatever the case, the bowl in your hand carries weight far beyond its ingredients. As you drain the last sip, the hall feels quieter, calmer. Children are already asleep by the hearth, servants clear the last trenches, and the nobles murmur in low voices. Outside, snow still presses against the gates, but inside, the steam of broth rises like a quiet promise. You set down the cup and understand something essential. Not every meal in a medieval castle was about spectacle or survival. Some were about care, the small acts of kindness hidden in bowls of broth. In those bowls, people found more than food. They found reassurance that winter would not break them completely. The hall grows restless as the days crawl deeper into winter. By now, most meals are predictable: salted pork, cabbage, pottage, ale. Yet the calendar itself interrupts the monotony, and tonight that interruption comes with ceremony, music, and candlelight. Christmas approaches, and even in the starkest season, the castle transforms itself into a place of celebration. Feasting, for one night, overwhelms scarcity. It is firmly established in chronicles and estate accounts that Christmas was one of the great feasts of the year. Even when larders were stretched thin, nobles poured resources into a banquet that declared not only piety, but also prosperity. If the castle could host a lavish feast in December, then it projected strength, stability, and divine favor, even if everyone knew hunger would return by February. You watch as the great hall is dressed for the occasion. Fresh greenery is hung along the walls, ivy and holly brought in from the frozen forest to soften the stone. Candles are set in clusters, their light bouncing against shields and banners. The air smells not only of smoke and meat but of spices, the unmistakable promise that tonight's food will be different. The centerpiece arrives first: a boar's head, roasted whole, garnished with rosemary and bay, an apple between its tusks. It is carried to the dais with ceremony, the servants singing verses as they march. The nobles lean forward, eyes wide, while the servants at the far end of the hall cheer in rougher voices. For this one night, spectacle fills the space as much as the aroma. Here's a curious detail from some records. The boar's head wasn't always eaten by everyone. Sometimes it was paraded as symbol, sliced ceremoniously for the lord, and then whisked away while other meats were served more practically. The sight mattered more than the taste. Imagine the irony, cheering for a dish you'd never get to bite. Debate still lingers among historians about the true scale of Christmas feasts in castles. Were they as extravagant as the chroniclers describe, with dozens of courses and exotic dishes? Or were those accounts exaggerated to flatter lords and impress rivals? Some argue that the reality was a single large meal dressed up in words, while others believe the spectacle was indeed overwhelming, even in harsh winters. The truth may be a mixture of fact and flattery, recorded in ink thicker than the broth itself. The kitchen tonight is chaos of the most festive kind. Geese are roasted, venison pies baked, and sauces thickened with wine and spices. Almond milk custards are prepared, honey cakes dusted with sugar, and jugs of hypocras spiced wine set out to warm near the fire. The cooks shout above the roar of flames, the air thick with scents that overwhelm your senses: cinnamon, roasting fat, sweet pastry, and burning wood all tangled together. At the high table, nobles receive dish after dish: swan, redressed in its feathers, pies filled with pigeon and rabbit, custards glowing yellow with saffron. Between courses, minstrels play, their instruments echoing against the rafters, their voices weaving songs of Christ's birth with tales of local lords' glory. The feast is both devotion and display. Down the hall, servants share in the abundance more than usual. Their bowls overflow with meat, scraps, pies, and pottage thickened with fat. For once, the portions are generous, and laughter rings louder than complaints. Children lick honey from their fingers, their eyes wide at the sight of cakes usually reserved for nobles. Even the dogs eat well tonight, gnawing bones slick with grease beneath the tables. What might surprise you is the ritual of sharing leftovers. Chronicles tell of castles opening their gates after Christmas feasts, distributing surplus food to the poor at the village edge. The act was both charity and theatre, ensuring that the lord's generosity was seen beyond the walls. Whether out of kindness or calculation, the gift of food meant that even those outside the castle tasted joy for a night. Yet even in such feasting, reminders of scarcity linger. The steward knows exactly how much venison pie remains, how many barrels of ale are tapped, how quickly the honey dwindles. While everyone else sings and claps, he stands silently by the door, eyes sharp, already worrying about January. Celebration cannot erase arithmetic. A quirky tidbit emerges from some accounts. During Christmas, meat pies were sometimes baked with hidden tokens inside coins, beans, or peas. Whoever found the token was crowned Lord of Misrule for the night, allowed to preside over games and merriment. You imagine the hall roaring with laughter as a scullion finds a bean in his pie and is suddenly crowned mock king, giving orders to nobles who must play along. For a few hours, hierarchy bent beneath mirth. But once the songs fade, the candles gutter, and the last bones are picked clean, reality returns. The boar's head is gone, the pies devoured, the wine drunk. Snow still blankets the land, and the stores are no fuller than they were yesterday. The feast is a pause, not a cure. Still, the effect lingers. Bellies are fuller, spirits brighter, and for one night the castle remembers abundance. You sip the last drop of hypocras, the spice warming your chest, and lean back in your chair. Tomorrow salted pork and cabbage will return. But tonight, the memory of feasting is enough to soften the winter's edge. As the fire burns low and the hall hums with sleepy voices, you realize the purpose of these celebrations. They were not only about faith or luxury, they were survival of another kind, the survival of spirit. For without joy, the cold walls would have crushed the heart long before spring returned. The echoes of Christmas songs fade into memory, and the laughter that once filled the great hall gives way to a quieter mood. After the boar's head, the honey cakes, and the cups of hypocras, a new season descends with its own set of rules. Lent. The merriment of December gives way to the austerity of February, and suddenly the tables inside the castle feel much emptier, even while the stores still hold food. The change isn't caused by famine, but by faith. One thing the records make plain is that Lent reshaped medieval diets profoundly. For 40 days leading up to Easter, the Church required abstinence from meat, dairy, and eggs. That meant no salted beef from the cellars, no pork from the barrels, No butter for bread, no cheese for pottage. Even the few eggs laid by stubborn hens were forbidden. The only exceptions came through dispensation or cunning reinterpretation, and those who broke the fast risked both spiritual guilt and social shame. You imagine sitting at the table on the first day of Lent, the memory of Christmas still vivid in your tongue, only to be handed a bowl of thin vegetable soup. The smell of cabbage and leeks returns, but now there is no fat, no butter, no meat broth to enrich it. The flavor is flat, watery, and unadorned. Hunger isn't the problem. The pottage fills your belly, but monotony is sharp enough to make you groan. Yet, in this absence, fish once again takes the stage. Barrels of herring, stockfish, and eels are rolled out, their salty tang filling the hall. At noble tables, cooks attempt creativity, almond milk thickened into sauces, spices sprinkled over boiled cod, dried fruit mixed into fish pies. At the servant's end, the same herring that was chewy in January is now the only protein, served again and again, until even the dogs turn their noses. Here's an odd workaround worth noting. In some places, beaver tails and even barnacle geese were classified as fish by church logic, allowing them to be eaten during Lent. Imagine the sly grin of a noble carving into roasted beaver tail, justifying it as piety because the tail was said to resemble a fish. The creativity of human appetite found loopholes wherever possible. But historians remain divided over how strictly these rules were followed. Some argue that wealthy households, with priests on payroll, found ways to bend the fast, adding almond milk custards, exotic fish, and fine sauces that turned abstinence into indulgence. Others believe that even nobles practiced genuine restraint, their diets stripped back to bread, vegetables, and pottage for weeks. The truth likely wavered, depending on time, place, and individual conscience. The kitchens during Lent are a strange sight. Butter is locked away, eggs sealed in lime water, cheese wheels left untouched. Almonds are pounded to make faux milk, turning thin broth into something that looks like cream but tastes faintly bitter. You hear the steady thump of pestles, the grind of mortars, the sighs of cooks forced to stretch imagination further than fat and meat ever demanded. At the high table, nobles are served dishes that disguise deprivation: fish pies baked with spices, rice puddings sweetened with honey, sauces dyed golden with saffron. To the eye, they still look splendid, but the absence of meat lurks beneath every dish. At the lower tables, servants chew their way through yet another bowl of vegetable broth, their eyes rolling at the sameness, their laughter thinner. What might surprise you is how deeply Lent affected morale. More than hunger, it was the repetition and denial that wore people down. Chroniclers describe tempers fraying, servants growing restless, children whining for buttered bread. The cold stone walls pressed heavier when every day tasted of cabbage and fish. Yet Lent also carried spiritual meaning. For some, the sacrifice made the Easter feast all the sweeter, the fast a ritual that heightened the eventual celebration. Faith and hunger wove together until survival felt both physical and spiritual. The debate among scholars persists. Was Lent truly a period of hardship, or was it a reconfiguration of abundance? Some argue that nobles turned it into an excuse for culinary invention, leaning heavily on almond milk, figs, and spices to keep dishes luxurious. Others suggest that monotony and deprivation were very real, particularly for servants who received none of the embellishments. Both versions might be true, depending on your seat at the table. You sip a spoonful of Lent pottage now. It is thin, green, flavored faintly with leeks and onions, thickened with barley. It fills your stomach but leaves your taste buds restless. You close your eyes and dream of butter, roasted pork, or even the egg custard from weeks before. The absence itself becomes the most noticeable flavor. Children chew bread silently, dipping it into broth. Servants mutter under their breath, though not loudly enough to risk the priest's scorn. The Lord sits straighter, reminding everyone of the holiness of abstinence, even while his own bowl hides a sprinkling of imported spices. Everyone plays their part. But the atmosphere in the hall is subdued, the joy of Christmas reduced to murmured prayers and long sighs. Still, Lent carries its own strength. It forces reflection, endurance, and a kind of equality, at least in the symbolism of shared sacrifice. For 40 days, even the richest castle feels the pinch of absence, though the poor taste it far more sharply. You set down your spoon, stomach warm but unsatisfied, and listen to the silence that fills the hall. Outside, the snow has crusted hard, the wind rattles the shutters, and inside, the absence of meat is louder than any feast. This is the rhythm of winter in the castle, joy followed by restraint, fullness followed by denial, until spring promises something new. The long days of Lent continue, and the hall grows quieter with each passing week. Without the noise of feasts or the cheer of ale-soaked laughter, you notice other sounds more vividly: the clatter of pots in the kitchen, the hiss of steam, the crackle of logs in the hearth. Tonight, instead of following the nobles to the high table, you wander behind the curtains and into the heart of survival itself, the castle kitchens. One detail that medieval building surveys make undeniable is that castle kitchens were enormous, smoky, and almost industrial for their time. High ceilings vented, or tried to vent, the thick clouds of smoke, while open hearths roared with constant flames. These kitchens were always busy, even in the dead of night, because food preparation for hundreds of mouths never stopped. In winter, the heat from the kitchens was both blessing and torment, the only truly warm place in the castle, but also thick with choking fumes. You step closer and feel the heat sting your cheeks. Cauldrons hang over iron chains, pots bubble furiously, spits creak as boys turn them by hand. The air is heavy smoke, grease, onions, and damp wool from the workers' clothes, all mingling into one overwhelming fog. Your eyes water almost immediately, but the smells also pull you closer. This is where survival simmers. A quirky observation from chroniclers is that the noise of the kitchens was constant and chaotic. Dogs barked for scraps, boys shouted as they dodged sparks, knives clattered against wood, and the bellows of cooks echoed across the stones. For nobles, meals appeared almost magically on polished trenchers. For servants and scullions, every dish represented hours of heat, smoke, and exhaustion. Yet scholars still debate how organized these kitchens really were. Some argue that large castles had a hierarchy as strict as a small army. Master cooks, undercooks, butchers, bakers, spitboys, and scullions, each with rigid roles. Others suggest that chaos reigned more often than order, with workers improvising to keep up with demand. Archaeological remains of sprawling kitchens support both views, hints of order, but also signs of frantic, messy survival. You watch a butcher lay a slab of salted beef on the chopping block, his cleaver flashing down with a heavy crack. Fat and salt crystals scatter across the wood. He wipes his brow, then shouts for more onions to be chopped. Beside him, a young boy stirs a pot so large he could almost fall in, the wooden spoon taller than his head. Steam billows up, soaking his hair with sweat. The hearth spits loudly as grease drips into the fire. Sparks fly upward, and the boy flinches but does not stop turning the spit. He hums to himself, perhaps to drown out the roar of the flames. The smell of roasting meat is intoxicating, so rich and strong that even servants turning away from hunger lick their lips. What might surprise you is how much food waste collected here. Floor rushes became sticky with grease, bones piled in corners, and scraps were swept aside for dogs or pigs. Kitchens were rarely pristine. Chroniclers describe them as noisy, filthy, and unbearably hot, yet also essential. Without this chaos, the great hall would fall silent. You notice how different the dishes look at each stage. One cauldron holds thin pottage, destined for servants, filled mostly with roots and barley. Another pot simmers with almond milk, raisins, and spices, prepared for the Lord's custard. A spit turns a rabbit stuffed with herbs, the smell rich and fragrant. Beside it, scraps of gristle are boiled into broth for the children by the hearth. The same kitchen produces both extravagance and survival, side by side, depending on who waits at the table. Scholars question how much variety cooks truly managed in winter. Some suggest that creativity with sauces and spices transformed monotony into abundance, while others argue that most meals remained repetitive, no matter how clever the cook. Was the castle kitchen a place of invention, or just a factory of boiled roots and salted meat? The evidence leaves room for both interpretations, depending on wealth and imagination. The sensory details overwhelm you now. Your eyes sting from smoke, your hands feel greasy just from the air, and your stomach clenches with hunger as smells of meat and onions swirl. You hear knives pounding against boards, pots bubbling like thunder, boys shouting for more wood for the fire. Every sense is battered until you understand why so many servants dreaded their endless hours here. And yet, there is comfort too. The heat against your skin makes you forget the icy corridors. The steam clings like a blanket, heavy but warm. The bustle feels alive, far more vibrant than the hushed cold of the great hall. In the kitchen, at least, food is still being made, hope still stirred. You glance toward a corner where the baker kneads dough. His arms strain, the flour dust rising in clouds, settling on his beard until he looks powdered with snow. The smell of baking bread cuts through the smoke, softer and sweeter than everything else. Children wait nearby, eyes wide, hoping for the first crusts pulled hot from the oven. Their smiles remind you that in winter, small mercies matter most. As you step back toward the doorway, you hear the steward scolding a scullion for dropping a jug of ale, his voice sharp against the roar of the fire. The boy stammers, head lowered, his hands red from burns. It is a reminder that kitchens were places of hardship as much as nourishment, filled with labor that left scars as well as meals. Still, as you walk away, the sounds linger. Pots bubbling, knives chopping, boys humming, dogs barking. It is a symphony of survival. The castle kitchen may be chaotic, smoky, and exhausting, but without it, the great hall would starve. And in the middle of a freezing winter, that noise is the sound of life itself. The smoke of the kitchens clings to your clothes as you step back into the hall, but your eyes are drawn downward, toward the farthest end of the tables. Here, where the torches burn dimmer and the food arrives last, survival looks very different. If the high dais boasts roasted venison and saffron custards, this part of the hall is fed on what remains: scraps, bones, and crusts. Tonight, you sit among them, watching how hierarchy reveals itself through what is left on the plates of others. One fact that no chronicler could erase is that medieval dining was profoundly stratified. The lord and his family sat closest to the fire, eating from pewter or silver, while further down the hall the servants ate from wooden bowls, trenchers of hard bread, or sometimes nothing more than ladled broth. Leftovers were not shameful here. They were lifelines. Surplus at the top became survival at the bottom. A servant clears the high table now, scraping bones, half-eaten pies, and greasy bread crusts into wooden tubs. You watch as these tubs are carried down the length of the hall, redistributed among the lower ranks. Dogs snap at the edges, servants grab quickly, children push forward with outstretched hands. There is no waste in the castle, not because of thrift, but because hunger leaves nothing untouched. A curious detail recorded in some household ordinances is that these leftovers even had a name: relishes or alms. They were often formally designated for the poor, either within the household or at the castle gates. Imagine a beggar waiting outside, his dinner entirely dependent on how much the lord's guests left uneaten. For him, a gnawed bone or a soggy trencher was blessing enough. But there is debate among historians about how much nourishment these scraps really provided. Were servants adequately sustained by what trickled down, or were they perpetually malnourished while nobles feasted? Some argue that the abundance of aristocratic tables ensured enough surplus, while others point to evidence of chronic hunger among lower ranks. The scraps may have stretched life, but whether they truly satisfied is a question still gnawed at like marrow from a bone. You glance at your trencher bread, hardened almost to stone, soaked now with the grease of venison. You bite into it, the flavor overwhelming in its saltiness and fat. For a moment, you understand why trenchers themselves were valuable. Once the Lord was finished, these plates became meals, handed down to servants or given as charity. In a castle where bread was currency, a trencher soaked in meat juice was as prized as any coin. The atmosphere at this end of the hall is different. There is less ceremony, more urgency. Servants slurp broth quickly, worried it might be taken away. A boy gnaws a rabbit bone noisily, grinning at the rare taste of meat. A woman tears bread with her teeth, her fingers greasy, her laughter brief but bright. Here, hunger sharpens both appetite and gratitude. What might surprise you is how formally leftovers were managed. Stewards kept accounts not only of what was bought and cooked, but also of what was left uneaten. Some castles designated specific days when scraps were distributed to villages, creating rituals of charity. Others sold the surplus back into markets, ensuring no crumb was wasted. Food, even half-chewed food, had value. In the kitchens, you see the other side of this system. Bones are boiled again for broth, fat scraped and saved for cooking, crusts dried into crumbs for thickening stews. Nothing disappears, everything cycles downward, from lord to servant to beggar to dog. The hierarchy of food mirrors the hierarchy of people, each level dependent on what trickled from above. A quirky tidbit: dogs, too, had their place in this food chain. Chronicles mention that noble hounds often ate better than some of the lowest servants, gnawing whole bones or scraps of roast. To sit at the far end of the hall and watch a dog crunch meat you would never taste was to understand your place in the castle more vividly than any speech. Yet scholars continue to argue whether this system bred resentment or acceptance. Did servants grow bitter, staring at the gilded pies carried past them? Or did they take pride in being part of a grand household where even scraps were richer than a peasant's meal outside the walls? The surviving voices are too few to know for certain. What we do see is that the structure endured for centuries, suggesting that hunger and hierarchy were woven tightly together. You finish your trencher, licking grease from your fingers, and glance again toward the high table. Silver platters gleam, goblets flash in the candlelight, nobles laugh over sweetened custards. Down here, the light is dim, the bowls wooden, and the laughter quieter. Yet the warmth of the broth fills your stomach, and for tonight, that is enough. The hall smells faintly of vinegar and grease now, mixed with the sourness of spilled ale. The rushes on the floor are sticky, dogs nosing through them for scraps. A servant wipes his mouth with his sleeve, another dozes against the wall. The feast at the top has ended, survival at the bottom continues. And you realize something important. Castles did not waste food because they could not afford to. Every scrap mattered, every trencher was eaten, every bone boiled until hollow. The Lord may have lived in splendor, but that splendor depended on the labor and hunger of those further down the table. Scraps were not charity, they were the system itself. You lean back, belly warmed by grease-soaked bread, and listen to the murmurs of tired voices. Outside, the snow presses harder. The wind moans against the walls, but inside the hall even scraps bring life. It may not be fair, it may not be equal, but it is survival, and survival is all that winter asks. The hall has grown hushed, scraps cleared, cups drained, and the servants nodding with weariness. Yet before the fire dies down, another procession of food appears, not meat this time, nor pies or broth, but something far simpler, and yet in its own way more powerful. Bowls of porridge are carried in, steaming and plain. At first glance, it feels anticlimactic after venison or saffron custard. But to those who eat it, this humble dish is as important as any roast, the quiet backbone of winter survival. The evidence is clear in medieval household accounts. Grains were the true staple that sustained castles through freezing months. Barley, oats and rye were boiled into porridge, sometimes stretched thin with water, sometimes enriched with milk, honey, or butter if available. Wheat, the most prestigious grain, was often reserved for bread at the high table, but oats and barley filled bellies morning and night across all levels of the household. You dip your spoon into the thick mixture and raise it to your lips. The texture is sticky, almost gluey, clinging stubbornly to the spoon. The flavor is bland, just warm grain, faintly nutty, slightly sour from fermentation. Yet the heat spreads quickly down your throat, steady and filling. After so many salty or greasy meals, there's something oddly comforting in its plainness. A curious observation from some chronicles is that porridge wasn't always plain. On special days, dried fruits or nuts were stirred in, transforming the dish into a kind of pudding. Honey, when available, made it sweet. Ale sometimes replaced water to give it extra body. Imagine the delight of children when a pot of ordinary oats suddenly gleamed with raisins or dripped with honey. In the monotony of January, such small additions felt like feasts. Yet there's disagreement among historians over how much variety these porridges actually contained. Did nobles eat enriched versions daily, while servants subsisted on thin gruel? Or did even lords settle for plain oats most mornings, saving embellishments for feasts? Some accounts suggest porridge crossed social boundaries more than other foods, appearing in different forms across the hall. Others argue that the noble versions, thick with cream and sugar, bore little resemblance to the watery bowls carried to the scullions. The truth likely lies between a shared dish but experienced very differently. The kitchen, still hot from the day's labour, bubbles with pots of porridge now. One cauldron is thick, enriched with almond milk and honey, destined for the high table. Another is thin, more water than grain, ladled into wooden bowls for the servants. The cooks stir constantly, wooden paddles scraping the bottoms to prevent scorching. The air smells faintly sweet, faintly sour, a background hum of sustenance rather than spectacle. The servants eat quickly, grateful for the warmth. Their bowls are emptied in minutes, hands cupping the wood for extra heat, steam softening their weary faces. Children giggle as porridge sticks to their chins, smearing across their cheeks. For them, it is comfort, less exciting than pies, but steadier than scraps. At the high table, nobles spoon their portions slowly. Their porridge is topped with butter, flavoured with cinnamon, dotted with raisins. To them, it is custard-like, almost dessert. The contrast is sharp, the same base dish, transformed by what is added. In this sense, porridge mirrors the castle itself, one foundation, many experiences. An unusual practice sometimes noted in records is the fermentation of porridge into a kind of sour mash eaten cold when fuel was scarce. It wasn't glamorous, but it saved firewood and stretched supplies. Imagine chewing through a cold lump of barley mash in February, convincing yourself it was still food. For many, this was reality. The debate among scholars persists. Should porridge be seen as survival food or as a flexible dish enjoyed in both humble and elite contexts? Archaeological remains of charred grains suggest it was universal, while cookbooks from noble households describe enriched versions. Perhaps the answer is both. Porridge was survival when plain, pleasure when embellished. You take another spoonful, the warmth spreading into your chest. It may not thrill, but it steadies, grounding you in the rhythm of winter. It is not a feast, not a celebration, but it is what allows those things to exist at all. Without porridge, the castle would collapse into hunger long before spring. The hall grows quieter still as the bowls empty. Some servants lick the last traces from their spoons, unwilling to waste even a smear. A boy scrapes his bowl with bread, determined to get every drop. The nobles dab their mouths delicately, satisfied. The dogs curl near the fire, licking at spilled oats on the floor. What might surprise you is how often porridge carried ritual meaning. In some regions, special grain dishes marked holidays or agricultural cycles, connecting the act of eating to the hope of future harvests. Even in the coldest months, The simple bowl in your hands was part of a story stretching from field to feast. You set down your spoon, stomach warm, limbs heavy with the steady comfort of grain. The snow still falls outside, the wind moans against the shutters, but inside, the castle breathes easier. For all the saffron custards and roasted swans, it is porridge plain, steady, enduring that has carried everyone this far. As the fire dies down and the hall drifts towards sleep, you understand its quiet power. Feasts make memories, scraps sustain the desperate, but porridge builds the bridge to spring. In every sticky spoonful lies the castle's most essential secret. Survival can be bland, but it is survival all the same. The hall lies dim now, most bellies quiet, but the castle itself never truly sleeps. Beyond the chambers of nobles and the palates of servants, another space hums softly with its own rhythm. You follow the faint warmth of firelight and find yourself in the bakehouse. Here, among ovens as tall as a man and stacks of flour sacks, the heart of daily life beats steadily. Bread was not simply food in winter, it was the very foundation of survival, baked day after day until spring finally returned. One certainty from medieval records is that bread dominated the medieval diet. For many, it provided more than half of their calories, sometimes more. In winter especially, when fresh produce vanished and meat supplies dwindled, bread filled the gap. Loaves varied in size, colour, and quality depending on rank, but every stomach in the castle, noble or servant, relied on the daily work of the bakehouse. You step inside and feel the heat rush against your face. Great clay ovens glow with embers, the air thick with flour dust. Bakers move constantly, their arms dusted white, their hands kneading rhythmically. The smell of rising dough fills the room warm, yeasty, alive in contrast to the frozen silence outside. It is a smell that promises continuity, day after day. The bread itself tells stories of hierarchy. At the high table, nobles ate manchet bread, pale and fine, made from the whitest wheat flour sifted again and again. Its texture was soft, its crust golden, its taste mild. Further down the hall, servants chewed maslin loaves, darker and heavier, made from mixtures of barley, rye, and oats. These loaves were coarse, sour, sometimes hard enough to chip a tooth. Yet they lasted, and in winter, lasting mattered more than luxury. A curious practice still noted in some accounts is the use of bread trenchers, thick slices of stale bread used as plates. At the end of the meal, trenchers soaked with meat juices and sauces were either eaten by servants, handed to beggars at the gate, or fed to dogs. Imagine eating not just your dinner but your dish as well. Hunger ensuring that nothing went to waste. But scholars debate how much variety existed in these breads during harsh winters. Were manchet loaves baked daily even in January, or were they saved for festivals while most ate only coarse rye? Some argue that wealthier castles maintained steady supplies of white flour, while others believe even nobles had to compromise in lean years. Archaeological studies of charred bread fragments reveal a mix of grains, suggesting reality was far less glamorous than the cookbooks imply. The bakehouse itself is a place of relentless labour. Bakers rise long before dawn, mixing flour, water, salt, and sometimes a sour starter. Their arms ache from kneading, their brows drip sweat despite the frost outside. They shovel loaves into ovens with long wooden paddles, listening for the hiss as dough meets hot stone. The rhythm is repetitive but vital. Without it, the castle starves. You bite into a piece of maslin bread, the crust tough, the inside dense and slightly sour. It fills your mouth, forcing you to chew slowly. It is not indulgent, but it is steady. You wash it down with ale, the combination forming the backbone of your meal. For a servant, this might be breakfast, lunch, and supper, all at once. At the high table, the experience is different. Nobles tear into soft white loaves, spreading butter or honey, dipping pieces into spiced sauces. Their bread is delicate, meant to please the palate as much as the stomach. The contrast between these loaves is as sharp as the difference between silver goblets and wooden cups. What might surprise you is how bread also carried symbolic weight. In Christian tradition, bread was tied to the body of Christ, and its presence at every meal held spiritual meaning. To break bread was not only to eat, but to reaffirm faith and community. Even the humblest Maslin loaf carried this sacred echo. A quirky tidbit from some accounts. Bread could also serve as medicine. Physicians recommended toasted bread soaked in wine for stomach ailments or crushed crusts as poultices for wounds. Even in sickness, bread remained central, bridging the line between food and cure. The debate continues. Was bread truly abundant enough to satisfy all in the castle? Or did shortages mean that servants often went hungry even when ovens blazed? Grain stores were vulnerable to pests, damp, and theft. Some years the loaves may have been plentiful, while in others, rations shrank alarmingly. Surviving inventories hint at both realities, reminding us that bread could be either comfort or cruelty depending on fortune. The bakehouse tonight glows warmly, the walls humming with heat. Bakers laugh as they pull loaves from ovens. Children sneak crusts, dogs beg at the doorway. For a moment, life feels generous. Yet the steward stands nearby, counting loaves, measuring carefully against the number of mouths to feed. Every miscalculation here could tip the castle closer to hunger. You chew another bite of bread, the crust scratching your mouth, the crumb dense but filling. It doesn't thrill like honey or dazzle like saffron custard, but it steadies you. In the rhythm of winter, bread is the drumbeat beneath every other flavor. As you step back into the hall, the loaves are distributed. Nobles smile. Servants chew silently. Children cradle pieces as if they were toys. The snow still presses against the shutters. The wind rattles the gates. But inside, bread binds the castle together. It is not spectacle. It is not luxury. It is life itself, baked fresh against the cold. The bakehouse embers glow faintly in your memory as you step outside into the bitter night. The snow crunches beneath your boots, and you follow the shadowy figures carrying sacks of grain from one building to another. Beyond the kitchens, past the storerooms and bakehouse, lies another crucial piece of the castle's survival puzzle: the brewhouse and dairy sheds, where preservation and ingenuity were as vital as any sword or shield. Tonight, you're reminded that food was never just eaten. It was guarded, rationed, and transformed with constant calculation. One well-documented reality is that preservation techniques were the backbone of winter diets. Without them, meat rotted, grain spoiled, and hunger crept in long before spring. Salted barrels, smoked chambers, pickling vats, and cool undercrofts all worked together like gears in a clock. The steward's job was not only to know how much food remained, but also how to keep it edible across endless months of frost. You duck into the smokehouse first. The air is dense, pungent, almost choking. Ropes of sausages hang from beams. Slabs of bacon glisten with grease hardened by cold, and fish dangle like pale ribbons. The smoke curls around you, sinking into your hair, your skin, even your tongue. It is not pleasant, but it is life-saving. Each strip of pork or herring here has been suspended between survival and decay by nothing more than salt, smoke, and vigilance. A curious little twist noted in some household records: smoked meats were sometimes brushed with honey or vinegar before hanging, both to flavor and to deter pests. You imagine a servant painting sticky honey onto a slab of pork, not for sweetness alone but to ward off the flies that even winter could not fully silence. But specialists still argue about the scale of such preservation. Did castles truly manage to store enough to feed hundreds for months, or were shortages inevitable? Some evidence suggests that salt imports were costly, limiting how much meat could be cured. Others point to vast cellars filled with barrels, enough to suggest careful planning and abundance. The truth, as often, likely lies between extremes: plenty in good years, desperation in bad. From the smokehouse, you step into the pickling room. Barrels here are filled with vegetables submerged in brine, cabbage, turnips, even beets. The air smells sharply sour, the tang of vinegar stinging your nose. You lift a lid and see pale vegetables bobbing in cloudy liquid, soft but still edible. Pickling stretched roots through February, ensuring that even when fresh cabbages shriveled, something greenish could still be spooned onto trenchers. What might surprise you is how common pickled fish was. Not only herring but eels, carp, and even pike could be stored this way, their flesh softened by vinegar, their flavor sharp enough to wake a weary palate. Served with bread, they gave the illusion of variety, even when every meal felt the same. The dairy sheds tell another story. Wheels of cheese sit stacked like bricks, some hard enough to last a year. Butter, when salted heavily, survives in earthen jars buried in cool earth. Cream is long gone, eggs sealed in lime-water jars, but cheese remains, stubborn and sharp. You touch one wheel, its rind hard, its smell pungent. It is less food than fortress, a block of milk transformed into stone against hunger. A quirky practice surfaces here too. Some estates even froze meat in ponds or snowbanks, using winter's own cold as storage. Chronicles describe carcasses packed in ice, pulled out weeks later, still edible. Imagine trudging out into the frozen moat to chip a deer haunch from its icy tomb. Primitive refrigeration, as ingenious as it was desperate. And yet, debates continue about whether such methods were practical across all castles. Was ice storage a common solution, or an occasional experiment recorded because of its novelty? Some historians believe it was rare, while others argue it was a clever use of climate in northern regions. The silence of most sources keeps us guessing. You taste a slice of pickled cabbage offered by a servant. It crunches softly, sour and salty, the brine flooding your mouth. It is not delicious, but it shocks your senses awake. After weeks of heavy meat, the acidity feels refreshing, almost cleansing. Down the hall, nobles too might have eaten pickled vegetables, though theirs would be dressed with herbs or saffron. Even preservation, it seems, was shaped by class. The kitchens tonight mix these stores into endless permutations. Salted beef stewed with dried onions, pickled cabbage stirred into pottage, cheese grated over porridge. For the high table, smoked fish garnished with raisins, pickled pears sweetened with honey. For the servants, the same ingredients appear stripped down, bare, still edible but stripped of finery. Preservation provides continuity, but never equality. You glance at the steward's tallies, his quill scratching under candlelight. Every pound of salt measured, every wheel of cheese accounted for, every barrel of pickled fish marked. He is less chef than mathematician, balancing survival against appetite, faith against hunger. His calculations are as important as any knight's blade. The sensory world of these storerooms clings to you now. Smoke in your hair, vinegar on your tongue, the musty tang of cheese in your nose. None of it feels festive. All of it feels essential. In a winter that seems endless, these smells are the background music of endurance. Dogs wander the corridors, noses twitching at smoke and brine. Children beg scraps of cheese, their faces puckering at the sourness. Nobles wrinkle their noses at vinegar but still eat it, knowing survival is built not on delight but on stubbornness. And as you chew a final piece of smoked pork, the salt burning your lips, you realize something important. The castle doesn't survive winter through feasts or fresh kills alone. It survives because of these quiet storerooms, these barrels of brine, these smoky rafters. Preservation is the true feast, long, slow, and steady. The snow may bury the world outside, but inside, the castle lives because someone salted, smoked, and stored with enough care. And in that act of foresight, you taste the real heart of medieval endurance. The sour tang of pickled cabbage still lingers on your tongue as you climb the winding stair toward the solar. Tonight the great hall is quieter than usual. The nobles have withdrawn to smaller chambers, leaving behind only the faint glow of the hearth and the scraps of supper. It is in these more private spaces that another part of winter dining emerges: ritual and etiquette. Food inside a castle was never only about filling bellies. It was also a performance of rank, piety, and power. A fact that leaps clearly from medieval etiquette manuals is that meals followed strict codes of behavior. Nobles ate in a carefully orchestrated order, seated according to hierarchy, served in sequence, and expected to perform gestures of grace and moderation. Even in winter, when food was scarce and repetitive, the ritual of how it was eaten mattered as much as what was on the plate. You settle into a wooden chair near the solar table and watch as servants bring in trenchers of bread, knives polished until they gleam, and basins of water for washing hands. Nobles dip their fingers delicately, drying them on linen cloths. At the far end of the chamber, musicians pluck strings softly. The food itself may be the same salted beef or barley bread that servants eat below, but here, presentation transforms it into an emblem of control. One quirky custom noted in several accounts: carving was often a specialized role, performed with elegance like a kind of choreography. To carve a joint of meat or portion a pie before the Lord required training in graceful movements, almost like a dance. Imagine a young squire slicing venison with theatrical sweeps, his knife glinting in firelight, as much performance as practicality. But scholars still debate how rigidly these rules were followed in daily winter meals. Did nobles truly observe elaborate courtesies even on bleak January evenings, or were such rituals reserved for high feast days? Some argue that formality persisted always, while others suggest fatigue and scarcity softened the rules in private. The uncertainty leaves us with two possible pictures: stiff ceremony by firelight, or relaxed meals where nobles chewed as plainly as their servants. The air tonight is quieter, more perfumed with incense than smoke. Bowls of pottage are still served, but here they are seasoned with saffron, garnished with almonds, and ladled into ceramic rather than wood. Wine is poured into goblets, not mugs, its color glowing deep red. The very vessels declare hierarchy. To drink from silver rather than clay is as meaningful as the drink itself. You take a spoonful, noticing how etiquette shapes the pace of eating. Nobles pause between bites, dab their lips with cloth, converse in measured tones. To gorge too quickly would signal greed, unbecoming of rank. Even in hunger, restraint was demanded as proof of civility. Downstairs, servants slurp and gnaw noisily, their survival judged not by grace but by speed. Another odd practice: salt itself was placed ceremonially on the high table. In many households, the salt cellar, often an ornate vessel, was positioned before the Lord, and one seat above or below the salt determined rank. Picture the symbolism. To be close to salt, the preservative of life, was to be close to power itself. Debate continues among historians about how universally these symbols mattered. Was the salt cellar a consistent marker of status across Europe, or was it a peculiarity of certain courts? Some evidence suggests its importance was exaggerated in later accounts, while other records affirm its central role. Like much of medieval ritual, clarity slips between description and reality. You glance around the chamber now. A lady lifts a morsel of cheese delicately, her fingers never touching the trencher directly. A knight bows his head before sipping his wine. Conversation drifts toward matters of politics, alliances, and scripture, the food itself almost secondary. Meals in this space are less about flavor and more about message, that order persists, that hierarchy holds, that even in hunger, control is never lost. At the lower end of the hall, things look very different. Servants huddle around a shared pot, spoons clashing, elbows jostling. There is no washing of hands, no careful carving. Crusts are torn with teeth, broth slurped noisily, laughter loud. If etiquette defines the noble's table, camaraderie defines the servants'. Both are forms of survival, one of dignity, the other of warmth. A curious tidbit: manuals of etiquette sometimes advised nobles not only how to eat, but also how to spit. Spitting into a shared bowl was frowned upon. Spitting discreetly onto the rushes at your feet was considered acceptable. Imagine the paradox: strict rules for grace and posture, yet an expectation that spittle would join the straw beneath your boots. The debate among scholars persists. Should we view these rituals as evidence of refinement or as empty theatre masking inequality? Some see them as genuine attempts at civility, shaping the foundations of later polite society. Others see them as tools of control, ensuring that even at the dinner table, power was visible and unchallenged. Perhaps both are true ritual as both beauty and barrier. You sip from a goblet, the wine faintly spiced, and feel the warmth spread. The firelight flickers across polished dishes, shadows dancing on the walls. For a moment, you understand how ritual itself created a sense of stability. Even when supplies ran low, even when hunger gnawed, the act of eating with grace convinced everyone that order still reigned. Yet as you set the goblet down, you hear the faint echoes from below: laughter, clattering spoons, dogs barking. Two worlds coexist under the same roof, divided not by stone walls but by the etiquette wrapped around each meal. As the nobles wipe their hands and servants clear the trenches, you realize that winter survival in a castle was not only physical but social. Bread and broth kept bodies alive, but ritual kept hierarchies intact. Without both, the cold might have fractured not just stomachs but the very structure of power. The fire in the solar dims, and the nobles retire to their chambers. But your feet carry you elsewhere down the draughty passageways, past the storerooms and kitchens, into a smaller space where voices murmur in hushed tones. Here the chaplain oversees a modest meal, one that is as much ritual as nourishment. In medieval castles, food was never only physical, it was also bound tightly to faith. Even in the bleakest winters, what you ate, when you ate, and how you blessed it carried spiritual weight. One undeniable truth from medieval records is that mealtimes often began and ended with prayer. Before lifting a spoon, nobles and servants alike were expected to bow their heads, murmuring gratitude to God for sustenance. In winter, when scarcity sharpened every bite, such prayers held an edge of desperation as well as thanksgiving. "Give us this day our daily bread" was no empty phrase. It was the literal plea of households staring into dwindling stores. You sit quietly now as the chaplain blesses a pot of pottage. The food is plain barley thickened with onions, flavoured faintly with herbs dried from summer. Yet as he raises his hand and chants the words, the steaming bowl becomes more than mush. It is sanctified, a reminder that eating is both survival and sacrament. When you lift the spoon to your lips, you feel not just warmth but also a sense of reassurance, however small. A quirky detail emerges in some sources. The placement of food itself could carry symbolic meaning. Fish was tied to fasting and humility, bread to Christ's body, wine to his blood. Even the simplest Lent meal of cabbage soup could be reframed as holy endurance. To chew through sour cabbage in February was not just necessity, it was a small echo of sacrifice, aligning daily hunger with spiritual duty. Yet historians still debate how genuinely religious these meals were. Did nobles and servants truly contemplate theology with every bite? Or were the prayers and symbols little more than habit, quickly forgotten once the first spoonful passed their lips? Some argue that faith saturated every aspect of life, while others see these rituals as perfunctory, more social expectation than spiritual fervor. The silence of ordinary voices leaves us guessing. You glance around the small chamber. A loaf of dark bread rests on the table, its crust cracked, its interior dense. The chaplain slices it with deliberate care, distributing pieces evenly. For him, bread is not only nourishment but symbol, and the act of sharing echoes the sacred. Servants chew slowly, their eyes lowered, their hunger briefly reframed as devotion. What might surprise you is that religious calendars dictated much of what was eaten in winter. Feast days allowed indulgence: meat, pies, even spiced wine, while fast days pulled diets back to roots, fish, and pottage. The rhythm of scarcity and abundance was shaped as much by liturgy as by supply. Imagine planning your winter meals not only around what you had, but also around what you were allowed to eat according to the church's clock. Another odd practice described in some chronicles: almsgiving of food after religious services. On certain holy days, surplus bread or pottage was distributed to the poor at the castle gates. Sometimes this was genuine charity. Other times it was theatre, reinforcing the Lord's image as pious provider. You picture villagers shivering in the snow, clutching scraps of bread given in God's name, both grateful and painfully aware of the imbalance. The debate continues among scholars. Should these gestures be seen as sincere acts of devotion or as instruments of power? Was almsgiving heartfelt or simply a way to display piety publicly? Both interpretations persist, shaping our view of castles as either sanctuaries of faith or stages of authority. Back in the chamber, the chaplain sips weak ale and speaks softly of penance. His words drift over the table, mixing with the smell of warm bread and steaming broth. Children fidget, servants nod, nobles murmur politely. For a moment, hunger feels less sharp, as though rebranded into virtue. To endure cabbage without butter becomes not just deprivation but discipline. The sensory world here is quieter than the hall. No dogs bark, no laughter erupts. Only the crackle of the fire, the scrape of spoons, the low hum of prayer. Even the food tastes different, because context reshapes flavor. The same barley that felt dull yesterday now feels holy, transformed by blessing. Hunger, it seems, is as much about meaning as about taste. You finish your bowl and feel warmth seep into your chest. It is not fullness but calm. The chaplain's words, the steady rhythm of prayer, and the humble food all conspire to make the winter feel less cruel. Faith does not fill stomachs, but it steadies hearts. And in a castle where despair could be as deadly as cold, that steadiness was its own kind of nourishment. As you leave the chamber, the snow presses harder against the shutters, the wind moans louder, and the torches flicker in the draught. Yet inside you carry a strange comfort, born not from meat or honey, but from ritual. Food in a medieval castle fed both body and soul, and in winter, when the body weakened, perhaps the soul needed feeding most of all. The chapel's prayers fade, the hall falls silent, and the castle seems to sink into the deepest stretch of winter. By now the salted pork has grown tougher, the pottage thinner, the bread darker. Supplies are carefully measured, the steward's records growing more anxious by the day. It is here, in late February and early March, that households enter the harshest season of all, what some called the famine months. It is a fact preserved in many estate accounts that by the end of winter, provisions were stretched thin. Barrels once filled with salted fish now revealed briny sludge at the bottom. Cheese wheels had been pared down to their rinds. Even the grain sacks grew lighter, their contents carefully doled out to make loaves last. The castle still ate, but the abundance of December felt like a fading dream. You watch the steward unlock the storehouse, his face pale in the lamplight. He lifts the lids of barrels, prods the contents with a stick, sighs. Every handful of grain is weighed, every wheel of cheese tapped for hollowness, every salted haunch counted again. His job is arithmetic in flesh and salt, how to stretch what remains until the thaw of spring. A curious, almost grim practice surfaces here. Some castles resorted to bulking pottage with sawdust, like bran or ground peas when grain ran low. The mixture filled the stomach but often caused discomfort. Imagine lifting a spoonful of porridge that tastes faintly of bitterness and grit, swallowing it anyway because there is no alternative. Yet historians still argue about the scale of late winter scarcity. Some estates may have managed stores so well that hunger was kept at bay, while others struggled chronically, their people thin and sick by March. Archaeological evidence of malnutrition suggests that shortages were very real, but whether every castle experienced them equally remains uncertain. The debate lingers like the taste of weak broth never quite resolved. The kitchens in these months are subdued. Gone are the bustling scenes of pies and roasts. Instead, one cauldron of pottage bubbles quietly, thinner each week, flavoured mostly with onions and leeks pulled from dwindling stores. Bread loaves shrink, their flour stretched with rye or oats. Servants work silently, their chatter dulled by weariness. The air smells not of feasting but of quiet endurance. At the high table, nobles still receive better fare, though even their meals grow simpler. Spices appear less often, imported fruits vanish, and sauces thin. A roasted fish might still be dressed with herbs, but the portions are smaller, the variety less dazzling. For servants at the lower tables, bowls are filled with watery pottage and scraps of bread, barely enough to quiet hunger. Children's faces look thinner, their cheeks hollowing. What might surprise you is how creative people became in these months. Cabbages that had begun to rot were peeled back to the still edible core. Pickled vegetables, sour and limp, were stirred into stews. Dried peas, tough and bland, were boiled into mushy pastes. Even bones already boiled once were reused to add flavor to the next pot. Waste was unthinkable. Another odd custom noted in some chronicles: when supplies grew dangerously low, some households observed ritual fasts, blending necessity with piety. By declaring abstinence holy, they softened the shame of hunger. Imagine kneeling in the chapel, stomach growling, convincing yourself that skipping dinner is not deprivation but devotion. In such moments, faith became a strategy of survival. The debate among scholars persists here too. Were famine months an inevitable feature of every winter, or only in years of poor harvests? Some argue that castles with wealth and trade connections always avoided true scarcity. Others point to recurring evidence of late winter hunger, suggesting that even the rich could not entirely escape the rhythm of dwindling stores. The truth, as ever, seems to shift between resilience and fragility. You take a spoonful of the late winter pottage. It is thin, almost watery, flavored mostly by onion. A chunk of bread, coarse and sour, floats in the bowl. It fills your stomach, but only barely. You chew slowly, savoring each bite not for pleasure but for its promise of keeping you alive one more day. Around you, servants do the same, their spoons scraping bowls until not a trace remains. The hall is quieter than ever now. Gone is the roar of feasts, the laughter of Christmas, the spectacle of swans and saffron. Instead, silence hangs heavy, broken only by the clatter of spoons and the sighs of weary bodies. The dogs lie still, too tired even to beg. Hunger has stripped away noise as much as it has stripped away luxury. And yet, there is endurance. Even in scarcity, the castle continues. Fires burn, bread bakes, pottage bubbles, prayers are said. Each day survived is a victory, however small. The memory of honey, venison, or spiced wine lingers, a reminder that winter has not always been so bleak and will not always be so bleak again. As you lean back from your empty bowl, the snow rattles harder at the shutters, but somewhere beyond the frozen moat, buds are waiting to break, fields waiting to thaw. Hunger is sharpest now, but the turning of seasons is inevitable. Spring will come, and with it, fresh greens, new lambs, and relief. For now, survival is measured in bowls of watery stew and crusts of bread, but survival itself is enough. You close your eyes, stomach faintly aching, and feel the weight of winter pressing down. Yet you also feel the flicker of hope that has carried the castle this far. Food has been salt, smoke, cabbage, porridge, and scraps, but it has also been ritual, celebration, and endurance. And in that endurance lies the quiet triumph of every medieval winter. Now, as the torches gutter and the last embers fade, let yourself drift. You've walked the cold corridors, tasted the salted pork, smelled the cabbage stews, heard the laughter at feasts and the silence of famine. You've seen nobles sip saffron wine, servants gnaw trenchers, children giggle over honeyed porridge. Through every meal, winter pressed at the walls, yet the castle endured. Close your eyes and picture the hall. Stone walls thick with frost, rushes on the floor, a single fire fighting against the draught. The tables stretch long, bowls steaming, spoons clattering, dogs padding beneath benches. At the far end, The Lord raises his goblet. At the other, a child chews bread quietly. The smell of smoke and salt fills the air, sharp and heavy, yet there is comfort in its familiarity. Let your breath slow as you imagine the kitchens, the hiss of cauldrons, the crack of knives, the thump of dough kneaded by tired hands. Smell the bread baking, the nuts cracking, the faint sourness of vinegar in the stores. Every sound softens, every image grows hazy, until only the warmth remains. And remember, winter always felt endless, but it never truly was. Each bowl of pottage, each crust of bread, each scrap of meat carried the castle one day closer to spring. Survival was not glamorous, not easy, not always fair, but it was steady, patient, enduring, just like the rhythm of your breath, now slow, quiet, unbroken. So rest here, in the great hall of stone and fire, where the cold presses outside but cannot touch you. Let the heaviness of full bellies, the calm of prayers, and the promise of spring wrap around you like a blanket. Sweet dreams,